Hey everyone. This is a piece by a guy named Henry Park. Um, he, I believe, is a Stalinist, a Maoist. From what I've been able to gather on the internet, he was involved in an organization called Maoist Internationalist Movement. But the reason I'm reading this piece because it's referenced in Marcel van der Linden's Western Marxism and the Soviet Union, and for purposes of interpreting critical, for researching critical left interpretations of the USSR, I'm going to read this. I'm not particularly stoked to be reading this because from what I've gathered from its conclusions and from what I know about the organizations this guy was involved with, he seems pretty fucking lame. For instance, I think the final paragraph of this piece has some gloating shit to say about Stalin, as a champion of, use value over exchange value or some bullshit like that. I'm gonna read the Wikipedia entry for Maoist Internationalist Movement. And then we can actually read the text. The Maoist Internationalist Movement was a clandestine revolutionary communist organization based primarily in the United States. MIM claimed to adhere to a radical ideology called Maoist Internationalist Movement Thought. Maoist Internationalist Movement listed a sole P.O. box in Ann Arbor, Michigan as its mailing address. Contrary to most Maoist groups in the West, which came from a firmly anti-revisionist pedigree out of the traditional communist parties, the Maoist International Movement was a product of elements of the American New Left student movement who formed the New Communist Movement. Maoist International Movement was founded as the Revolutionary Internationalist Movement in 1983 from a group called Radacads, for, quote, radical academics, end quote, at Harvard University. It is not to be confused with the Revolutionary Internationalist Movement that was founded the following year in France by Maoist parties around the world, the most notable of which are Shining Path and Bob Avakian's RCP USA. All of Maoist Internationalist Movement's publications were anonymously written. Authors do not sign their names to articles. Instead, writers use the moniker MC X end bracket, parenthesis, MIM Comrade X, end parenthesis, where X is a number. This was reputedly to prevent their members and supporters from being known by the state and also to keep the focus on theoretical line and arguments rather than people in personal relationships. Marxist Internationalist Movement published a bi-weekly newspaper, MIM Notes, and had an occasional Spanish-language publication, Notas Rojas. Maoist International Movement also published a theory journal titled Maoist Internationalist Movement Theory, of which 14 were released up until 2001. Maoist Internationalist Movement also published Maoist Sojourner, quote, a monthly publication by and for Third World Maoist exiles, end quote, which according to Maoist Internationalist Movement website, the Maoist International Movement website, quote, died as a publication thanks in part to internal sabotage and quitters, end quote. A post on the Maoist Internationalist Movement website titled, quote, where we are at theoretically at the end quote, dated February 15th, 2008, appeared to announce the end of Maoist Internationalist Movement. The post states that there will be no further posts on the Maoist Internationalist Movement website and announces a postmortem website, Maoist Internationalist Movement Light. According to the February 15th, 2008 post on Maoist International Movement's website, quote, there will be no new content here, no more stepping on toes, and no defense of political gains, if any. End quote. Sorry, not end quote. Maoist Internationalist Movement Light will take up the few leftover tasks, end quote. While it is not said explicitly that Maoist Internationalist Movement no longer exists as an organization, this is strongly implied, and there appears to be no new activity subsequent to the February 15th, 2008 post. In May 2008, it was announced that Maoist Internationalist Movement Light would be retired. In August, a new blog was announced called Maoist Internationalist Movement Defense, with the stated purpose to, quote, defend the leaders of ex-Maoist Internationalist Movement, the Maoist Internationalist Movement, people who continue on the course of anti-war and anti-imperialist struggles, end quote. Statement from Henry Park about going above ground. Henry Park is stated to be the author of Maoist Internationalist Movement Down and Maoist Internationalist Movement Defense. In January 2009, Maoist International Movement's web host, eText Archives, ceased operations. The content formerly hosted by the eText Archives, including Maoist Internationalist Movement, is still available at the Maoist Internationalist Ministry of Prisons and via the Internet Archive. Maoist Internationalist Movement continues to publish articles at WordPress. Henry Park attempted to recover the original feel of the eText website by relocating Maoist International Movement Down from WordPress to mimdown.org. Maoist Internationalist Movement founder Henry Park died on the 17th of May 2011. The Maoist International Ministry of Prisons has continued to organize and has maintained its own website since the collapse of the Maoist Internationalist Party America. In early 2016, an organization referring to itself as Maoist Internationalist Movement Orchid appeared on GitHub, publishing Proletarian Internationalist Notes, PI Notes, which offers news, reviews, and analysis from a Maoist global perspective. The Revolutionary Anti-Imperialist Movement, RAIM, and its website, antiimperialism.org, cites the Maoist Internationalist Movement as an influence. The Revolutionary Anti-Imperialist Movement evolved from the Revolutionary Anti-Imperialist Information Network and was originally intended to be the imperialist country mass organization of the leading light communist organization, LLCO, before these two organizations split. LLCO does not consider itself to be a Maoist organization, claiming to uphold a post-Maoist ideology called leading light communism, explicitly distinguishing themselves from Maoist internationalist movement theory. All right, so that's the organization that this guy was affiliated with. Sounds whack. Is whack. But research must proceed. Secondary Literature on the Question of the Restoration of Capitalism in the Soviet Union by Henry Park. Section 1. Why determine the political-economic nature of the USSR? In order to maintain a critical view of the world, It is necessary to hold society up to society's claims and society's potential. For the Western capitalist countries, there is an abundance of Marxist literature criticizing their claims to democracy, progress, and human liberty. Oh, who's there? To do the same for the so-called socialist countries. So criticize. Okay, there is Western capitalist countries. Okay. For the Western capitalist countries, there is an abundance of Marxist literature criticizing their claims to democracy, progress, and human history. To do the same for the so-called socialist countries is not just a question of justice and even-handedness. It has everything to do with the strategy and experience of social change. To hush up the question of the political economy of the Soviet Union is to undemocratically promote ignorance among people concerned about social change. Certainly, no third world armed liberation struggle could fail to take stock of Khrushchev's, quote, peaceful coexistence and, quote, peaceful competition with the Western imperialist countries, nor could they fail to have intellectual bearings on the question of, quote, peaceful transition to socialism, end quote. Even a non-Marxist national liberation struggle would want to evaluate whether or not the Soviet Union has imperialist motives. The peoples of Afghanistan, Eritrea, Poland, and other Soviet-dominated countries could hardly fail to wonder. In the West, the anti-militarist movements should certainly have a theory about how to save the world from World War III. There already exists a Marxist-Leninist theory of why capitalist nations become imperialist and go to war. Has the supposed application of Marxism-Leninism in the Soviet Union eradicated the capitalist causes of war? The Soviet Union cannot help having an influence on how the world looks at social change. That influence must be evaluated. A. Why the Marxist analysis of capitalism? Marxism is the first school of thought that should come to mind in evaluating so-called Marxist-Leninist societies, since Marxism is so well developed on the basis of a study of capitalism. It would pay to link studies of a capitalist society to that body of studies. Indeed, we will see that the actual political economy of the USSR resembles that of capitalism, so that the criticisms of capitalism may apply to the USSR. Moreover, in the analysis of capitalism as a world system, it is crucial to determine whether or not there are two world systems or only one. Important aspects of international political economy cannot be understood without an understanding of the USSR, how accumulation will occur within the Soviet bloc, and its influence on the Western bloc, and what relations with the Third World will exist. B. Marxist categories as distinctions with a difference. Marx developed all his categories with a mind at criticizing and grasping the nature of particular historical context or the connection between historical periods. Marx's major work, Capital, develops categories that themselves are designed for the critique of capitalism and the advance of revolution, which was Marx's first and foremost concern. We shall argue that the most important categories of Marx's Capital apply to the Soviet Union. The implication of the theoretical analysis derived from them are thus expected in an examination of Soviet society. First, in the first few pages of Capital, Marx distinguishes between exchange value and use value. Quote, as use values, commodities are, above all, of different qualities, but as exchange values, commodities are merely different quantities and consequently do not contain an atom of use value, end quote. Marx. In a deep sense, utility is unrelated to prices in the Marxist theory. Instead, the law of value states that commodities exchange in proportion to the socially necessary labor time embedded in them. This is just a side note. In the Marxist sense, utility is fundamentally related to prices. Price being a much more concrete concept than value. Prices are way more subject to empirical fluctuations, which include questions of utility, insofar as supply and demand. Marx is, I think personally, this is my personal thing. I've gotten this from David Harvey, who otherwise I'm not particularly, didn't get too much from his work on Marx's Capital, but the idea that when supply and demand are in equilibrium, they cease to explain anything. They cease to explain the quantity of value. Value is a more abstract concept than price. So in actual, the concrete world, the particulars of any singular price can be very much affected by utility. For instance, if a commodity, for instance, a piece of machinery, right, is outdated and cannot produce the same type of output that a newer machine can, the price of that piece of equipment is going to tank, even though the labor that went into it remains the same, or the amount of value of it in the sense of labor may have remained the same. So careful here with the conflation of value and price. Anyway, I'm just being an asshole. Instead, the law of value states that commodities exchange in proportion to the socially necessary labor time embedded in commodities. Marx would have no patience for comparing essentially unlike and subjective utilities. Perhaps Marx would have sanctioned a notion of collective utility of classes, individuals with a shared objective interest. There may be a proletarian utility or a bourgeois utility, but that is not relevant to the present discussion of commodities. A second critical distinction Marx makes is between labor and labor power. As Eric Olin Wright states, this distinction is part of Marx's agenda that focuses on the labor process. The distinction leads to the question of how production is organized to coerce labor out of labor power. A third distinction Marx makes is between necessary and surplus labor. Here, necessary labor is obviously a historical sociological category. That labor which goes to providing the worker's subsistence as defined by norms and culture of the worker's historical context is necessary labor. The rest is surplus labor. Here, there can be no question that there must be a decision about the surplus, made about the surplus. This is where class struggle enters. The distinctions between exchange value and use value, labor and labor power, and necessary and surplus labor are unfortunately evocative in the study of the USSR. We shall have to examine the implications of the application of these categories. New section. Section 2. The three major schools of thought on the political economy of the USSR. The secondary literature on the political economy of the Soviet Union is extremely rich. For a discussion of the restoration of capitalism thesis, it is useful to distinguish among the schools of thought based on their position towards the operation of the law of value in the Soviet Union. The law of value states that commodities exchange in proportion to the abstract socially necessary labor time embodied in them. The first position that should be considered is the official Soviet position. The position of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, CPSU, has been that the Soviet Union has either been on the way to socialist, or on the way to communism, depending on how soon after the revolution the question arises. No matter what stage in the advance to communism, the Soviet economists have always held that the law of value operates in the Soviet Union. It was Stalin who first declared the USSR socialist. According to Stalin, the law of value operated in the Soviet Union at least as late as 1952, when he wrote Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR. In Stalin's view, a major difference between capitalism and socialism was that not everything about the Soviet economy was decided by the law of value or by the exchange of equivalents. Sometimes the Soviet government consciously decided to do something of use to the proletariat, regardless of the living and dead labor involved. For example, X pints of vodka may require little socially necessary labor time compared to Y pairs of pants. Yet the government set the price of X pints of vodka higher than that of Y pairs of pants as a conscious decision to subsidize clothing at the expense of vodka consumption. Thus, proletarian use-value judgments erode the law of value through proletarian planning. Partly as a response to Keynesianism, economists towards the end of Stalin's rule started to view the law of value in a different light. Later, we will give a historical materialist explanation for why this change might have occurred. In any case, the buzzword of the economists since Stalin is, quote, lever. These economists believe that planners can use the law of value for the benefit of the economy. The implication of this view is that material incentives, wage structures, and private criteria can be used to create an expected and increased level of production. In this view, questions of proletarian priorities are abstracted. Presumably, public ownership will determine that the public benefits from increasing its own. Presumably, public ownership will determine that the public benefits from increasing its own production. Increasing its own production. Social consumption will increase with production. After all, what evil is there in controlled commodity relations if in the end social consumption increases? The position of the current Soviet economists grades nicely into the position of Western Marxist apologists of the USSR, who formed the second school of thought discussed here. The late Albert Szymanski makes the most persuasive argument concerning social consumption. Quote, the percentage of the wage in the Soviet Union or working class consumption that is consumed collectively on the basis of need has been increasing, and the percentage that is on the basis of material incentives or labor has been decreasing. In the 40s, about 22% of what a worker consumed came as social consumption. That is, free education, free health care, and subsidized daycare. Today it's over a third, about 35% for an average worker, and if you're a lower paid worker, it's over 50%. End quote. Lada and Szymanski. Let's see who this Szymanski person is, huh? Let's see. It looks like Szymanski wrote a book titled Is the Red Flag Flying? The Political Economy of the Soviet Union. Since the October Revolution of this is the description for the book. I can't find anything for Albert Szymanski. Wait, I only looked up his last name. Let's see if. Go on. Let's party. it looks like he wrote for... I don't know. It looks like he's involved with... was involved with insurgent sociologists, the Insurgent Sociologist Journal. Um, let's look that up. I can't find anything on him, but that seems important. It looks like Insurgent Sociologist evolved into a journal that's now called Critical Sociology. So let's just read the little description here for Critical Sociology. Critical Sociology is a peer-reviewed academic journal that publishes papers 6 times a year in the field of sociology. The journal's editor is David Fassenfest at Wayne State University. Critical Sociology has been in publication since 1969 and is currently published by Sage Publications. In the past, it has been published by Brill Publishers. According to the journal citation reports, the journal has a 2022 impact factor of 1.9, ranking in 84th out of 149 journals in the category Sociology. Critical Sociology aims to encourage critical thinking by publishing articles from all perspectives defined as falling within the boundaries of critical or radical social science. The journal publishes works which explores the relationship between race, gender, and class. Critical Sociology also provides a forum for the discussion of research and findings. Critical Sociology was established in 1969, originally under the name of the Insurgent Sociologist. Critical Sociology emerged from radical agitation within the American Sociology Association in the wake of the '68 radical movement. Since then, the journal has become a key pole of radical and critical research in the social sciences. Okay, so that's all I got for Zemansky. And it looks like he wrote a book called Is the Red Flag Flying?, which I think might be cited in this book. Yeah. Since the description for Is the Red Flag Flying? The Political Economy of the Soviet Union says, since the October Revolution of 1917, there has been considerable debate among both socialists and enemies of socialism on the class nature of the Soviet Union. This debate waxed and waned over time in good measure as a function of the international policies of the Soviet Union and its enemies. We have seen a great revival of interest in the question among sympathizers of the Cultural Revolution era of the People's Republic of China, which in 1967 had claimed that capitalism had been restored in the Soviet Union. Many of the issues and arguments raised by various branches of the Trotskyist movements in the 30s and 40s are once again being discussed and supported by the Maoist camp in response to this debate. On the other hand, defenders of the Soviet Union continue to claim that the country was socialist, and this book expounds in detail just why socialism was indeed still prevailing in the Soviet Union at the time of its publication in the late 1970s and early 80s. Back to the text. Zemansky is familiar with the restorationist thesis and targets the Maoist position in particular. Zemansky agrees with the Maoists that the question of which class holds state power is first and foremost in a discussion of the nature of the USSR. So Zemansky asks, why, if there is a bourgeoisie in power, does the bourgeoisie not use that state power to pass along its position by birthright? Why it does not increase its consumption level to meet Western standards? Why it does not try to create divisions within the working class? Particularly why intra-working class income differentials decrease since Stalin? And why is social consumption increasing? What does the bourgeois use its state power for? Goldfield and Rothenberg, 1980, ask many of the same questions. Szymanski does, although an increase in production cannot verify the socialist nature of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union is not socialist in their view. And who are these people? Goldfield. It looks like they wrote a book called The Myth of Capitalism Reborn, a Marxist Critique of Theories of Capitalist Restoration in the USSR, published in San Francisco by Line of March Publications. Wikipedia says Michael Goldfield was born in 1943. Michael Goldfield is an American political scientist, author, labor activist, and former student activist. Michael Goldfield is an emeritus professor of industrial relations and human resources in the Department of Political Science at Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan, and a faculty associate at the Harry Bridges Center for Labor Studies at the University of Washington. And who's the other guy? Goldfield and Melvin Rothenberg. Looks like Melvin Rothenberg was taught mathematics at University of Chicago. Myth of Capitalism Reborn. Let's see if there's any description for the myth of Capitalism Reborn. This book is originally from 1980, and the back matter says, this book analyzes and criticizes the thesis that capitalism has been restored in the Soviet Union. This incorrect thesis originated with the Communist Party of China and is the theoretical foundation of the Communist Party of China's theory of the three worlds. The Myth of Capitalism Reborn is a major contribution to developing a Marxist-Leninist analysis of the history and present-day reality of the USSR, published by the Soviet Union Study Project. Back to the text. Goldfield and Rothenberg, 1980, ask many of the same questions Szymanski does, although an increase in production cannot verify the socialist nature of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union is not socialist in their view. Like Szymanski, they argue that the law of value does not operate in the Soviet Union. There is planning, and as Szymanski said, the 1965 reforms only grant enterprises as much autonomy as branches of American corporations. Factory directors are about as powerful as American corporations. Factory directors are about as powerful as American foremen. Factory directors are about as powerful as American foremen. They are bound by yearly plans in production and do not have enough autonomy to allow for the law of value. Finally, and admittedly problematic for our argument here, the Soviet Union does not have unemployment or business cycle crises as it should if Marx's theory of capitalism applies. Goldfield and Rothenberg Rothenberg, are also neo-Maoists, and that they are familiar enough with the Maoist position to criticize it. The Trotskyists generally support the economic arguments that the Soviet economists make for themselves in terms of the imperative of increasing production and social consumption. At the same time, however, the Trotskyists believe that they know best how to apologize for the Soviet Union. Unlike Zhymansky, they do not believe that the Soviet Union is socialist. Nonetheless, the Trotskyists believe that the law of value does not operate in the Soviet Union, the single defining characteristic of the second school of thought treated here. H. Tickton argues that the problem is in the bureaucratic nature of planning, but that there is planning nevertheless. Contradictions arise in the use values created in the Soviet economy because of the imperfection of the planning bureaucracy. Similarly, the standard Trotskyist position is that the USSR does not need a social revolution, only a bloodless political revolution, a reform at the top with Trotskyists in power. This would result in the democratization of socialism and an end to distortions of the Stalinist bureaucracy. The third position, that the Soviet Union is characterized by bureaucratic collectivism, is more critical of the USSR than the other positions discussed so far. Still, Milovan Zhilas, 1957, and Antonio Carlo, 1974, do not argue that the law of value is the problem. Instead, Zhilas and Carlo argue that the bureaucrats own the means of production as a class. Zhilas and Carlo have little interest in worker consumption except to the extent... that's not they. The bureaucrats have little interest in worker consumption except to the extent that they came to power with the help of the workers. Indeed, the bureaucrats tend to seek production for production's own sake. In both politics and production, survival of bureaucratic collective power is the issue. In Carlo's case, the emphasis on heavy industry results in one-sidedness. Ironically, it is the private agricultural sector that provides production for use. The bureaucrats cannot resolve the problems of ever-spiraling heavy industry, and inevitably come to sympathize with the capitalist solution to their technical problem of how to increase production. Ruled by bureaucratic collectivism until 1965, the USSR turned capitalist in 1965, according to Carlo. An underdeveloped capitalist country may have a bureaucratic collectivist revolution, but with its development, it returns to capitalism as a developed country. I'm pretty sure I have the piece by Carlo on this channel. Let's see. Yeah, socioeconomic nature of the USSR, that's on this channel. People with a background in Trotskyism developed the thesis of state capitalist restoration in the years of Stalin's rule. It is fitting that the transition from the second major position, the apologist position, to the third position, the restorationist position, be marked by Tony Cliff. Cliff's book, State Capitalism in Russia, is a book that every Marxist must come to grips with. If the Maoists are devastating for their attack on assumptions about the current USSR, Tony Cliff thoroughly demolishes assumptions about the Stalin era held by some Maoists. Although Cliff's attack on Stalin comes from a political position unlike our own, there is much analysis of economic organization embedded in Cliff's book that is useful here. Later, when we discuss the evidence for the restoration of capitalism in the USSR, we'll use Cliff to demonstrate the material basis for Khrushchev's capitalist counter-revolution. Despite the popular efforts of the Revolutionary Union, its successor, the Revolutionary Communist Party, and the Organization for Revolutionary Unity, the most definitive and damning study of the Khrushchev period and the Lieberman reforms in Russia is W.B. Bland, The Restoration of Capitalism in the Soviet Union. Let's see if there's any descriptions of this book. It's on the internet. Let's see. See if I can find a description of this book. I didn't see one. It looks like the W.B. Bland is Bill Bland. Bill Bland lived from 1916 to 2001. I'm not seeing. Let's see. I'll read he's got a little biography here. It says, Bill Bland was born in north of England into a middle-class home. Bill Bland was spent his politically formative years in the Army of New Zealand, where he was active in the Communist Party as an educator. Bill Bland returned to Britain in the post-war years as an ophthalmic optician. In the 1950s, Bland witnessed the Communist Party of Great Britain embracing the, quote, peaceful road to socialism and Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin. Bland believed these, quote, revisionist stances were incorrect and anti-Marxist-Leninist. Bill Bland therefore became a member of several anti-revisionist formations in Britain. Bill Bland soon joined forces with Mike Baker in the Marxist-Leninist Organization of Britain. Shortly thereafter, the, quote, Cultural Revolution occurred in China, and prompted by a barrage of questions, Bill Bland undertook a systematic study of Mao. Bill Bland found that he could not agree with Mao's theory of the, quote, new democratic state, and penned within months the first refutation of Mao from the point of view of a pro-Stalin supporter. At that time, the Marxist-Leninist Organization of Britain rapidly dwindled in size as many members retained affection of Mao. This was the first of Bland's many unpopular analyses in the pro-Stalin wing of the communist movement. Bill Bland spent the rest of his life trying to answer the question, quote, how had revisionism become ascendant, end quote. Bland came to the conclusion that Stalin had been in a minority position in the Politburo, surrounded by hidden revisionists too clever to openly attack Marxism-Leninism. Further, they had straitjacketed Stalin by means of erecting the, quote, cult of personality, which was then used as a weapon against Stalin. Bill Bland felt that Yezhov had subverted the secret services who had been placed at Stalin's behest by Beria. Bland pointed, for example, to the release of many thousands of wrongly imprisoned Bolsheviks. Bland then argued that by the 18th Party Congress, Stalin had been excluded from the highest echelons of the party decision-making apparatus and had counterattacked with his pamphlet Economic Problems of the USSR. Stalin's essay was a seminal attack on Nikolai Voznesensky, who was linked to Khrushchev. Consequently, argued Bland, the latter economic changes re-establishing capitalism in the USSR had been fought to a standstill by Stalin. Bland therefore argued a specific significance for Stalin's last work. As Bland saw it, once Stalin was dead, the capitalist, quote, reforms of Voznesensky were enacted by Khrushchev and his successors. He formulated these views in articles that culminated in the book Restoration of Capitalism in the USSR, published in 1981. Following his analysis of Maoism as, quote, left revisionism, Bland began to question his own long-standing support for the then pro-Chinese Party of Labor of Albania, but concluded that the People's Socialist Republic of Albania remained socialist. Before the 20th Party Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Bill Bland had founded the Albanian Society of Britain at the invitation of the PSRA. Despite now being officially ostracized by Albania, Bland continued his work running the Albanian Society and organizing an enormous education on this isolated, solitary socialist country. In those years, Bland became an acknowledged authority on all things Albanian. Bill Bland published an English Albanian dictionary, and Bill Bland fielded any manner of queries upon arcane features of Albanian life, history, music, food, geography, customs, and mores, etc. While China was supported by the Albanian Party, some of the Maoist parties had run an explicit party front, Albania Society, resisting Bland's call for one single, united front Albanian society, regardless of, quote, narrow party affiliation. Following Hoxha's open attack on Mao, some of these societies split and some died. Their remaining members were correctly advised by the Foreign Liaison Committee of the PSRA to join with Bland's organization to form one united front of support for the PSRA. But they launched attempts to remove Bland's leadership, charging that an emphasis on all aspects of life, such as music, etc., was, quote, anti-Marxist-Leninist, end quote, and, quote, insufficiently political, end quote, and that Bland should be removed. The membership rejected this attempt to remove Bland. The society continued till the revisionist takeover of the PSRA by Ramiz Alia, at which point Bland resigned from the Albanian society. It was primarily differences over Bland's analysis of Albania as socialist that precipitated the split in the Marxist-Leninists of Britain. Is that what MLOB stands for? Yeah, Marxist-Leninist Organization of Britain. It was primarily differences over Bland's analysis of Albania as socialist that precipitated the split in the Marxist-Leninists of Britain in 1975, following which the Communist League came into existence. The Communist League, from its inception, always supported the People's Socialist Republic of Albania as a solitary socialist state. Those that stayed with the Marxist-Leninists of Britain, including Mike Baker and his supporters, rejected that position. One specific aspect of modern revisionism, to which Bland paid close attention, was the subversion of the second stage of socialist revolution into a static national democratic deviation. Or, I don't know if it's a typo. Into static national democratic deviations. For Bland, this represented a distortion from the Marxist-Leninist theory of the nation. In these categories, Bland placed the pseudo-quote socialist revolutions of China, Cuba, North Korea, Vietnam, and Tanzania. Bill Bland argued that all of these had ignored Lenin's injunction not to build a, quote, Chinese wall between the first, parenthesis, national democratic, and parenthesis, stage of revolution, and the second, parenthesis, socialist, and parenthesis, stage. Bland also argued that other phenomena, such as the, quote, black nation, end quote, in the USSA, quote, black racism, end quote, and, quote, Scottish, Welsh, and Cornish nationalism, end quote, in Britain, represented national deviations away from socialist revolution. These views led Bill Bland to challenge fundamental Stalinist premises. If the Soviet Union had been permeated by a class war involving the highest echelons of the party, was the Comintern any different? Bill Bland puzzled over several related matters. Why had the Comintern performed so many about-turns on key questions, such as the nature of the United Front? Was Stalin really in control of the Was Stalin really, quote, in control, end quote, of the Comintern? Why had the People's Front governments been supported beyond any credible point by European communist parties, especially in France, in assisting a fascist takeover? And why did the ultra-left rejections of a united front of the late 1920s swing suddenly into ultra-right distortions of correct united front policy, etc.? Bill Bland argued that the first ultra-left deviations in the Comintern in the period from about 1924 to 1928 had allowed fascism to take power in Germany. In the same period, under the cover of this ultra-leftism, Manuilsky and Kutusow had destroyed the Indian Revolution by sabotaging Stalin's line of the workers' and peasants' parties. Bland thought that the second-right deviations from about 1930 onwards had prevented the masses of Europe taking power under Communist Party direction. Bland now further argued that Stalin had not been in a leadership position in the Comintern since around 1924 as follows. Initially, Zinoviev had exercised the leadership, and thereafter Bukharin. When both were exposed as, quote, revisionists, they were purged from further influencing the Comintern. Both were later shot. Thereafter, Dimitrov, Otto Kusanin, and Dmitry Manuilsky exercised the Comintern leadership. Bland argued that they had perverted a correct implementation of Marxism-Leninism. Dimitrov had been sprung from the German fascist prisons thanks to a rather dubious and surprising, quote, leniency of the German fascists. Quote, why? Asked Bland, replying that a pact had been struck, as shown when Dimitrov went on to subvert United Front tactics into the right deviation of supporting, quote, Popular Front governments beyond Marxist-Leninist principles of the correct United Front tactics. It was for these reasons, argued Bland, that the Comintern was dissolved by Stalin. Stalin then created the Common Form under a completely different leadership, led by his most trusted lieutenants such as Zhdanov. It must be remembered, said Bland, that it was the Common Form that had exposed the Western Communist plans for implementing right deviationist policies, and the Titoites for allying with the USA. During the later historic confrontations, Stalin overtly supported Albania and Hosha against Tito. Apart from his theoretical works, Bland wrote a number of plays, directed 2 films, and created a ballet. A lifelong, intense love of the arts, especially cinema and theater, led Bland to reaffirm the principles of socialist realist art. Bland wrote widely on theater and film and on the history of theater. In Britain, Bill Bland led the Communist League to argue the principled unity of all Marxist-Leninist forces. Hence Bland's role in the early stages of the National Committee for a Marxist-Leninist Unity, NCMLU. Bill Bland also formed the Stalin Society in the UK, but the pro-China factions within the Stalin Society ensured Bland's later expulsion. Bland was a key figure in the formation of the international struggle Marxist-Leninist and was cited as a major influence by Alliance Marxist-Leninist North America. Okay, so that's who Bill Bland is. Thank you for allowing that digression. Let me repeat the last thing I read. Despite the popular efforts of the Revolutionary Union, its successor, the Revolutionary Communist Party, and the Organization for Revolutionary Unity, the most definitive and damning study of the Khrushchev period and the Lieberman reforms in Russia is W.B. Bland's The Restoration of Capitalism in the Soviet Union. The book's strength is that it is based almost solely on the work of Soviet economists and government documents. An examination of the facts as presented by Bill Bland dispels many myths propagated by Western apologists of the USSR. The third position discussed here, that of seeing a restoration of capitalism, shares with the Soviets' own view, the understanding that the law of value is promoted and utilized in the Soviet Union. Ironically, the Western Marxist-Leninist apologists of the Soviet Union often claim more socialism exists in the Soviet Union than the Communist Party of the Soviet Union claims. Contrary to the binding wish of Soviet apologists to see socialism in the USSR, the Soviets themselves recognize that their, quote, central planning, end quote, never works and is impossible to carry out with the degree of pricing independence that exists in the economy. The Communist Party of Soviet Union is quite frank in describing its economic organization and the importance of the role of profit. For example, it has merely watered down the theories and definitions of socialism and communism so that the Soviet Union could label itself socialist. Unfortunately, the Western Marxist apologists of the Soviet Union choose to believe that the Soviet Union actually meets the most exacting requirements to qualify as a socialist society. New section, Section 3, the criteria of capitalism. We would like to pick the criteria that define capitalism so that they are flexible enough to apply to the Soviet case while still not destroying the validity of Marxist categories and the results that flow from Marxist theory. This is an effort in theory, refinement, and application. In examining the modes of production, Marx found that wage labor characterizes capitalism in particular. Slaves were bound to their masters, serfs to their land. Wage labor is relatively free, but is nonetheless a commodity. Given the dominance of wage labor, production under capitalism is for exchange. Commodity, money, commodity, parenthesis, commodities exchanged for money exchanged for commodities, in parenthesis, is replaced fundamentally by money, commodity, money prime, or more money. Money prime, or more money, indicates that the capitalist has realized surplus value in the process of consumption of labor power and the sale of the commodities created. Modes of production previous to capitalism had a greater emphasis on production for use, though that use may have been the exploiting class's use. Thus, where there is predominantly production for exchange value, surplus appropriation takes the form of surplus value. The class that appropriates that surplus value from free wage labor can be none other than a capitalist class. This is where historical flexibility is required. Most of Marx's analysis is based on the relatively competitive capitalist conditions of his day. Still, the dominance of private property in the context of wage labor is a sufficient but not necessary characteristic of capitalism. Quote, capital, which in capital's self rests on a social mode of production and presupposes a social concentration of means of production and labor power, is here directly endowed with the form of social capital, parenthesis, capital of directly associated individuals, in parenthesis, as distinct from private capital, and its undertakings assume the form of capital, and its undertakings assume the form of social undertakings as distinct from private undertakings. It is the abolition of capital as private property within the framework of capitalist production itself, end quote. Marx. Furthermore, the development of credit shows that, quote, the control over social capital, not the individual capital of his own, gives him control over social labor, end quote. What is noteworthy about this is that social capital is not perceived as a mere sop for the private capitalists. Social capital is the form of exploitation in its own right. In addition, the development of social capital, quote, leads here to a centralization of capital, thus to expropriation on the most enormous scale. Expropriation extends here from the direct producers to the smaller and medium-sized capitalists themselves, end quote. Marx. Sorry, let me reread that. Social capital is the form of exploitation in its own right. In addition, the development of social capital, quote, leads here to a centralization of capital, thus to expropriation on the most enormous scale. Expropriation extends here from the direct producers to the smaller and the medium-sized capitalists themselves, end quote. Marx. Thus, Marx spoke of, quote, appropriation of social property by a few, end quote. The bureaucratic collectivist position and the state capitalist thesis are strengthened by this concept of how the bureaucracy may approach seemingly public property and still be capitalist. Engels applied the state capitalism concept more directly than Marx. Quote, the modern state, no matter what its form, is essentially a capitalist machine, the state of the capitalist, the ideal personification of the total national capital. The more the modern state proceeds to the taking over of productive forces, the more does the modern state actually become the national capitalist. The more citizens does the modern state exploit. The workers remain wage workers, proletarians. The capitalist relation is not done away with, it is rather brought to a head, end quote. Engels. Moreover, Engels believed that such a process would occur first with the post office, telegrams, and railways. By the time Lenin wrote on state capitalism, Lenin saw it as a tool to smash petty commodity production in the countryside during the NEP, and thus saw the NEP as reaching for state capitalism as a progressive goal. Under the new economic policy, profit was decreed the object of production. Workers received bonuses out of profits and firms expanded themselves out of their own profits. Lenin considered the NEP to be the use of state capitalist methods and a necessary retreat towards capitalism that could go too far. Lenin labeled those who thought the NEP was permanent, quote, frank enemies, and, quote, counter-revolutionaries, end quote. Now there has been enough discussion of Marxist categories for a definition of capitalism to be ventured. Capitalism is a system of class relations whereby the surplus labor of wage labor is appropriated by a group alien to the working class. That group may be the competitive capitalist, the monopoly capitalist, or the state capitalist. The capitalist class exercises dictatorship of the proletariat and other working classes. Socialism is a system of class relations whereby the surplus of wage labor is appropriated by the laboring classes, where the law of value is restricted through the restriction of bourgeois right, and where the division of labor is restricted and broken down. The proletariat, in alliance with other laboring classes, exercises dictatorship over the bourgeoisie. This is for a critique of this whole kind of this schema here. Check out the piece by Adam Buick, the Myth of the Transitional Society. That's on this channel. Also, the work of Chattopadhyay. Socialism and the dictatorship of the proletariat are two distinct concepts, and socialism and communism are not distinct stages in Marx. That is something that's later applied. Socialism being referred to as like lower stage communism, which kind of acts like there's some kind of definitive socialist stage that you achieve, and then communism comes after that at some point. And especially when you conflate socialism with the dictatorship of the proletariat, as problematic as the term dictatorship of the proletariat might be, you have this idea that if you have a substantial class dictatorship, you've achieved socialism, which is a collapsing of two distinct notions. Anyway, that's just a thought for myself. Capitalism requires wage labor, capitalist exchange-oriented production processes, parenthesis, profit orientation or a market share goal, for example, end parenthesis, and an enforcement mechanism that ensures that some capitalists fail depending on their progress towards exchange-oriented goals. Under competitive conditions, it is well known that bankruptcy and merger ensure survival of the fittest exploiters. Under monopoly conditions, bankruptcy and takeover mergers are supplemented by the rising importance of war. It was Lenin's genius to see imperialist war as an inherent mechanism of monopoly competition and accumulation. Under state capitalism, a particularly important mechanism for the enforcement of commodity relations is government takeover and reorganization. Quote, inefficient, end quote, managers, as judged by their plant's profit index and other exchange value denominated and hence fetishistic criteria, will be replaced or subjugated to higher, more, quote, efficient exploiters. Even struggles over price control have implications for managers. Even where planning is guided by conscious political priorities, the question remains whose plan, whose use value. ITT plans in Chile, GM plans for technology implementation and labor control. Has South Africa not succeeded in planning its economy for self-destructive purposes? Has not the Pentagon, which is better than any which is bigger than any Soviet ministry, succeeded in planning its own growth? It is only in an ultimate sense in which it can be said that capitalism cannot plan, because only in the ultimate sense will the pursuit of the use value of the capitalist class be fruitless. Imperialism will end up on the ash heap of history, but the imperialists are no doubt capable of planning for goals that are themselves contradictory and self-destructive. Tichton's analysis is that the Soviet bureaucracy is pursuing a plan, just the wrong plan. The bureaucrats are pursuing use value, but fail because they're out of touch with the needs of the masses. Tichton cites examples of the failure of Soviet plans which end up in the production of an item that nobody wants. Tichton calls this a, quote, product which is a contradiction within that product's use value, end quote. Tichton, 1978. The alternative explanation offered here is that this kind of failure results either from the production of use value for capitalists or, more often, from the anarchy of plain old capitalist production. Although it is interesting to contemplate the Trotskyist position that political revolution is needed to set the plan straight, or the bureaucratic collectivist position that bureaucrats pursue power and the struggle for survival through heavy industry mania, it is unnecessary. Such processes are subordinate to exchange value processes in the USSR. Indeed, we shall indulge in overkill in this article in presenting the evidence for the domination and operation of the law of value in the Soviet economy. There are more than enough avenues for surplus appropriation to take the form of surplus value. For the moment, we will go beyond the essential definition of capitalism offered here and agree to use or criticize the criteria for capitalism that are adumbrated by Szymanski in his debate with Lota and by Godfield and Rothenberg in their Myth of Capitalism Reborn. For Szymanski, the criteria are 1. Labor power is a commodity consumed in the money prime process. 2. A ruling class exists, parenthesis, and has comparable privileges to the ruling classes of the West, end parenthesis. 3. The restoration of capitalism brought qualitative deterioration for the working class and qualitative improvement for the bourgeoisie. 4. The logic of capital export is dominant. For Goldfield and Rothenberg, it is sufficient that the USSR not have a society in transition to socialism. It is sufficient that the USSR not behave as a society in transition to socialism, presumably because if it were not transitional, it would be pulled by the capitalist world back into capitalism. The 4 transitional criteria are 1. That there is no capitalist class, parenthesis, and there is no private appropriation, in parenthesis. 2. There is a consciously and politically motivated national plan that dispenses with the anarchy of production and the drive for surplus value. 3. Unemployment and labor insecurity is eliminated, and there is no labor market. And 4. The means of production are not distributed in a market, but by the national plan. Among the total of 8 criteria suggested by apologists for the Soviets, parts of 2 are problematic for our Maoist fucking spacing out, dude. Among the total of 8 criteria suggested by apologists for the Soviets, parts of 2 are problematic for our Maoist thesis that capitalism has been restored in the Soviet Union and will be discussed at the end. Theoretically, we will bow to vulgar consumption-oriented Marxist theory and try to demonstrate the privileges of the Soviet ruling class, although there is no statistical way of knowing whether or not the relative position of the Soviet bourgeoisie to the Swedish, British, or American bourgeoisies is close enough to establish a qualitative similarity. Finally, as seen already, Marx did not say that private appropriation of wage labor was a necessary characteristic of capitalism, only a sufficient characteristic of capitalism. New section, Section 4, Analysis of the Restoration of Capitalism. A. The need for a periodization and a corresponding theory. History will make history's weight felt in the argument over capitalist restoration, if only because there are so many possible dates for seeing the restoration of capitalism. First, in 1917, according to the anarchists, the Bolsheviks betrayed the Russian Revolution by seizing power for itself in a coup d'etat. Any doubts about the nature of the Communist Party's Soviet Union were erased with the crushing of the Kronstadt rebellion of anarchists and other anti-Bolshevik radicals in 1921. According to the former Maoist sympathizer Cyril Berthelin, in his third volume of his book, Class Struggles in the USSR, says, quote, "The October insurrection presented the October insurrection itself under the illusory figure of a socialist revolution. While it opened the way to a specific type of capitalist revolution, October is thus at the origin of that which one can call the grand illusion of the 20th century," end quote. Bettelheim. Just as a side note, Bettelheim comes from like a Stalinist and then Maoist background, but towards the end of his life, he does appear to adopt more libertarian communist positions. For instance, if you read this book, I haven't read this whole book, but I have the introduction to it recorded. The Class Struggles in the USSR, I think it's 1930 to 1941. I'm not sure the exact dates on it. But in that How to Read This Book, he basically lays out a council communist understanding of the Russian Revolution. That's a little more like sympathetic to Bolshevism in terms of like not like agreeing with it necessarily, but kind of like despite its self-understanding, it had a socialist self-understanding, but what it was really doing was creating the grounds for a capitalist revolution. It's basically what you can find in people like Helmut Wagner, and also in a different way, Amadeo Bordiga, right? Amadeo Bordiga had the belief that the Russian Revolution was supposed to be part of a grander chain of world revolutions, grander chain in world revolution, and due to its it was a capitalist revolution undertaken by communists. Which is a very interesting thing that doesn't mean the Bordigas reject Leninism or whatever, but they viewed that what the Bolsheviks' task was what was left for the Bolsheviks to do was to establish capitalism in the USSR and develop its mode of production in a context of isolation. What made the USSR counter-revolutionary was didn't seem particularly was counter-revolutionary about it was internal economic dynamics for the Bordigas, but their kind of subordination of international revolution in other places that could take on a communist character to the needs of Soviet state policy. That's the socialism in one country as like an international policy is what made the USSR reactionary, as opposed to its like capitalist development, which I think Bordiga viewed as progressive. Very interesting stuff. I'm really enjoying learning about all these different interpretations of the USSR. And I think also, too, I feel like maybe... never mind. Other candidates for the restoration of capitalism are the fall of Trotsky and Stalin's supposed political counter-revolution, the first five-year plan and collectivization, the downfall of the last of Stalin's political opposition, some point between the death of Stalin in 1953 and Khrushchev's speech in 1956. In 1965, the key year for the Lieberman reforms. The most tenable position is the Maoist position that a new bourgeoisie arose in the top ranks of the Communist Party Soviet Union and seized power. The birth and growth of the new bourgeoisie in the Communist Party Soviet Union was a historical process with roots in conditions that started to exist immediately after 1917. Khrushchev's secret speech in 1956 is only the first time that the West came to understand the gravity and outcome of the post-Stalin power struggle. Khrushchev did not create capitalism with his secret speech. Rather, just as there are climactic events in every revolution, Khrushchev's coming to power was a culmination of broad historical forces. True, Khrushchev discarded Lenin's theory of imperialism for, quote, peaceful coexistence. Khrushchev also believed that the USSR had become a, quote, dictatorship of the whole people, end quote, which forced his supposedly Marxist-Leninist Western apologists into the strange position of having to argue that the CPSU does not know what its own superstructure is about. I think wasn't that kind of like the idea that it was no longer a dictatorship of the proletariat, like kind of like in the like Soviet constitution? Like, am I making that? Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I feel like I have like the gut feeling that the idea that the kind of like particularly class character of the Soviet Union was no longer in existence. Like I'm pretty sure that like Stalin declared socialism and the abolition of classes in some sense was achieved at the time of the Constitution. I'm not sure about that though, but I'm feeling like I'm right about that, or am inching towards some kind of truth with that. Even when Khrushchev no longer claimed that the USSR was a workers' state, the Trotskyists continued to argue that the Soviet Union is a, quote, deformed worker state, end quote. Parenthesis, a reification of the state unless there is a class of, quote, deformed workers, end quote, end parenthesis. Well, the Trotskyists used the word degenerated, which has a different connotation than deformed. Degeneration means like something that had potential declining, right? The worker state degenerated. A deformed worker state is an appellation the Trotskyist movement gave to the Soviet bloc after those economies in, say, East Germany and Poland and all those places adopted the Soviet model of economic development and the same similar political structures. Those were the deformed worker states, which are distinct from the Soviet Union, which was still labeled a degenerated worker state. Back to the text. Thus, the political watershed events from 1953 to 1956 proved to allow a myriad of interpretations. While various proponents of Trotskyism and anarchism came to their conclusions from studying bureaucracy in the state, Mao came to the only Marxist conclusion that starts with a critique of the relations of production. According to Mao and Mao's followers in the Shanghai School of Political Economy, each of the three aspects of the relations of production has something to do with generating the new bourgeoisie that comes to exist in the Communist Party of a socialist state. Yeah, I'm not seeing a good description of this. One second. Oh, okay. Sorry, I didn't see anything, but it does. It seems to be that there's a book that says it's titled by Raymond Lotta that's been referenced before. I haven't looked up, but I guess I'll look back at the end of the book. But it's called Maoist Economics and the Revolutionary Road to Communism, the Shanghai Textbook. And it says, can a socialist planned economy work and work in a way that leads away from exploitation, inequality, and greed of capitalism? The defenders of capitalism say no, but Fundamentals of Political Economy, a path-breaking book about socialist economic theory, offers a different and exhilarating answer. Here is a work about the Maoist experience from 1949 to 1976, in which 1/4 of humanity transformed an economy, a society, and themselves through socialist revolution, ... A visionary work written by Maoist forces during the Cultural Revolution that the present rulers of China have suppressed, ... A valuable contribution to the ongoing discussion and debate about the nature, purposes, and feasibility of a planned socialist economy, a book for all who dream of and struggle for a new world. Back to the text. According to Mao and his followers in the Shanghai School of Political Economy, each of the three aspects of the relations of production has something to do with generating the new bourgeoisie that comes to exist in the Communist Party of a socialist state. First, the hallmark of socialism is the proletarian ownership of the means of production and the end of bourgeois right to hire and exploit labor. Nonetheless, in the accumulation process, it is possible under socialism that production will advance technically in fashions inaccessible to the workers unless class struggle is waged to prevent this. In other words, the technocrat may displace the worker in control of his workplace and production. However, even more important than, quote, worker control, end quote, is proletarian political control at both the factory level and the national level. There must be revolutionary administration in the factory and at the top where the plan is made. Issues of politics decide who actually owns the nominally and legally public means of production. Second, the political stance of the proletariat is to restrict bourgeois right in distribution. In other words, socialism is marked by remuneration, quote, according to work. But if this principle were absolute, the law of value would be absolute. There would be no way to remunerate workers for product or public services that did not generate exchange value equal to that remuneration. Moreover, the enforcement of bourgeois right in distribution has a tendency to result in accumulation of inequalities that result in class polarization. This is especially true because of the legacy from capitalist society. Workers and intellectuals who had the benefit of more and better educational and work experiences will contribute more socially necessary labor than others. Related to this process of accumulation by the beneficients of capitalist society is the prestige and other perks associated with certain jobs in the division of labor. A scientist can expect a very high level of prestige under capitalism and translate that prestige into administrative control. Third, the division of labor between rulers and ruled, the administrators and the administered, the city and country, the mental and manual, and the male and female does not disappear under socialism. Already it has been discussed how if workers hand over the production process to technocrats and experts, they will lose ownership. Likewise, if the peasants or farmers allow the cities to do all the government work, they too will be expropriated. The division of labor cannot be allowed to build up, or it will mean the reemergence of a capitalist class and the exploitation of labor power. Bourgeois right includes not only the right to exploit labor power and the right to pay according to work, but also any attendant privileges of work under capitalism. Hence, bourgeois right continues to operate under socialism, where the state still must decide employment and income policies, and where the division of labor does not disappear. Wait 1 second. I wanted to look up this Raymond Lotta person. It says Raymond Lotta is an advocate for Bob Avakian's new synthesis of communism. He's a political economist, author of where the hell did the fucking description go? Here we are. This is from something called Insight Press, which is what? Insight Press is an independent book publisher founded in 2004. Our featured author is Bob Avakian, architect of the new communism. We invite you to browse through the books we published and the extensive information about them and their authors on this website. Insight Press is a member of the Independent Book Publishers Association. And the description for Raymond Lotta says, Raymond Lotta is a political economist, writer for revcom.us, and a spokesperson for Revolution Books, New York City. Raymond Lotta is a follower of the revolutionary leader Bob Avakian and an advocate for the new communism developed by Avakian. Lotta has written and lectured extensively on the, quote, first wave of socialist revolutions, the Russian Revolution 1917 to 1956, and the Chinese Revolution 1949 to 1976. Notice that both those years are when the so-called revisionists come to power. So 56 would be Khrushchev, and I guess 1976 would be Deng Xiaoping. Raymond Lotta had edited and wrote the introduction for Mao Makes Five, a collection of documents delineating the struggles within the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. In 1973 to 76, culminating in the counter-revolutionary coup d'etat following Mao Zedong's death in 1976. Lotta edited and wrote companion essays for Maoist Economics and the Revolutionary Road to Communism, a text on socialist political economy produced by the Maoist forces in China. Lotta has advanced the understanding of the innovative principles guiding and the enormous achievements of China's planned socialist development under Mao. Raymond Lotta also has written on the, quote, state capitalism of the former Soviet Union in the years 1956 to 1991. In 1983, Raymond Lotta and scholar Albert Zemansky held a major debate at Columbia University. Soviet Union, socialist or social imperialist? Raymond Lotta has directed the Set the Record Straight project and its website, thisiscommunism.org. The project refutes the slanders and harmful mispresentations spread about the Russian Revolution and Chinese Revolution. Applying Bob Avakian's new communism, the project rescues from distortion the overwhelmingly positive achievements of these socialist revolutions, especially the breakthroughs of the Cultural Revolution led by Mao, but also analyzes their problems and shortcomings and how, based on the new communism, humanity can go further and do much better in a new wave of communist revolution. Raymond Lotta has toured U.S. campuses, including UCLA, Harvard, University of Chicago, to, quote, open up great debate about the historical truth of these revolutions and the need for communist revolution in today's world, end quote. The ebook, titled You Don't Know What You Think You, quote, know about the Communist Revolution and the Real Path to Emancipation, Its History and Our Future, published with Insight Press in 2014, based on interviews with Raymond Lotta, is a comprehensive overview and analysis of the first wave of communist revolution. Raymond Lotta's work of political economy include America in Decline, Shifts in Fault Lines in the World Imperialist Economy, On the Driving Force of Anarchy and the Dynamics of Change, Imperialist Parasitism and Class Social Recomposition in the USA from the 1970s to today, an exploration of trends and changes. His 2021 study, the, quote, industrialization of sexual exploitation, imperialist globalization, and the descent into hell, is a work of rigorous research and visceral outrage. Raymond Lotta has written and lectured on how capitalism, imperialism, is the cause of global warming and looming environmental catastrophe. Raymond Lotta helped develop some key principles of socialist sustainable development. Lotta states, quote, "This system and its rulers are taking humanity over the cliff, ... and the revolution gives us the chance to save the planet," end quote. Raymond Lotta. All right, so that's who Raymond Lotta is. Back to the text. New section. B. A thumbnail sketch of the history of Soviet economic organization. The revolution occurred during World War I, and a state of war continued with Germany until March 1918, when the Bolsheviks made their concessions and pulled out of the war. When the Bolsheviks also had a class war to fight at home against the White Army, then the Bolsheviks also had a class war to fight at home against the White Armies. The period of war communism saw conscious planning by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, but everything was done by command and requisition. Didn't the Soviet Union not get declared until 21? Yeah, it was founded December 30th, 1922. That's what I thought. The period of war communism saw conscious planning by the Communist Party Soviet Union, but everything was done by command and requisition. During the war communism period, equality of sacrifice narrowed the ratio of the income of most skilled workers to the income of unskilled workers from 2.32 in 1917 to 1.02 in 1921! Exclamation point. There is speculation about the end of money and commodity relations. Wages in kind were 94% of income. See Lane, 1982. Overall, the emphasis was on, quote, getting things done, end quote, without the luxury of experimentation with new organizational procedures in production. Lane, 1982. The end of... Okay. I'll look that book up. What's being referred to here is David Lane's 1982 book, The End of Social Inequality, Class Status and Power Under State Socialism. The description says, The End of Social Inequality, published in 1982, examines class and social stratification under state socialism, and in particular in the Soviet Union. Its discussion ranges over such aspects as income and education, differentials, the rise of white-collar occupations, the position of women in ethnic groups, and social mobility. Its chapters include the impact of Marxist ideas in Russia before and after the October Revolution, social inequality, Soviet sociology's interpretation of the social structure, 3, social inequality, hierarchy and privilege, 4, social mobility and political class, 5, class cleavage and control, and 6, conclusions. And it says Professor David Lane is an emeritus professor of Emmanuel College, Cambridge University, UK, and previously was professor of sociology at the University of Birmingham. David Lane is a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. David Lane has published widely on state socialist societies, the USSR, Marxism, elites, class, and social stratification. David Lane's current research focuses on transformation, globalization, quote, varieties of capitalism, end quote, neoliberalism, alternatives to capitalism, the enlargement of the European Union, and the formation of the Eurasian Union. Okay, back to the text. Overall, the emphasis was on, quote, getting things done, end quote, without the luxury of experimentation with new organizational procedures in production. Despite the role of the workers and soldiers Soviets in the revolution and its immediate aftermath, by 1918 the Soviets embarked on one-man management in the factories. Syndicalists and others disaffected by the dictatorship of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union brought up discussions of increasing the role of the Soviets or trade unions. There were some wins of this sort, especially in the late 1920s, but the Soviet Union has never abolished one-man management. The actual power of the worker in the workplace was questionable as early as 1918. By 1935, one-man management had crystallized as requiring absolute obedience, and as the most important principle of socialist economic organization, according to one Soviet economics text. Cliff, 1974. Perhaps to the extent that the war politicized production through commandeering it, and to the extent that the USSR had little room to experiment, and given the constant threat or actuality of famine, worker power in the factory was not first priority, where proletarian political power was yet hanging on a thread. It is not surprising that in the relatively comfortable position of the late 1920s, that calls for worker participation and control were heard again. Moreover, it is not hard to see that the necessity of collectivizing agriculture and the necessity of industrialization to prepare for further hostilities with the encircling imperialist nations were on Stalin's mind as rationalizations for one-man management. Nevertheless, one-man management is hard to justify under Stalin, and even harder to understand in one of the great industrial countries of the world, which has chosen the path of, quote, peaceful coexistence. With the easing of the war situation and the defeat of the imperialist interventions, Lenin turned the USSR towards repair. Speaking of the war communism phase, Lenin called it a mistaken, quote, jump that went too far. Lenin now turned around to call for a little, quote, local turnover, meaning trade by the peasantry. The most important aspect of the new economic policy was the new economic policy's attempt to meet the food crisis caused by war and the return of soldiers from the front. The new economic policy gave the peasants the necessary market incentives to resume normal grain production. Lenin regarded the new economic policy as a dose of capitalism to restore production. The new economic policy's highest aim was to use state capitalism to replace the several modes of petty commodity production still existing in the Soviet Union. Having nationalized transport, utilities, mines, industry, and foreign trade, the Bolsheviks thought that with their control of these, quote, commanding heights, end quote, of the economy, they would retain control despite the general free market instituted under the new economic policy. See Park, 1986, and Lenin, 1937. They're the selected works. New Economic Policy, Socialist Construction is the piece by Lenin being referred to. And the piece by Park is titled, is this being referred to? Let me look at the 1986, Post-Revolutionary China and the Soviet New Economic Policy. That's published in Research in Political Economy, Volume 9. Anyway, back to the text. When agricultural production recovered and appeared to be peaking with the, quote, procurement crisis, end quote, arguments surfaced saying that the rich peasants, parenthesis, kulaks, and parenthesis, had to be prevented from gaining further influence in the countryside and the CPSU itself. Industrial capacity also started to regain its full employment. Stephen Bukharin, who is the leading spokesman of the Alliance with the Individual Peasant Farmer, started looking for ways to boost industrial capacity. Trotsky and Preobrazhensky called for a massive tribute from the peasantry in the form of, quote, primitive socialist accumulation, end quote. Later, many were to say that Stalin followed this policy. However, there are two ways in which Stalin's brutal accumulation drive differed from Trotsky's plan. First, it occurred 5 years after Trotsky wanted it. During these 5 years, industrial capacity met industrial capacity's limits, and the government encountered problems in procurement of grain for the cities. which the Communist Party Soviet Union made the mistake of blaming on a, quote, kulak strike. Secondly, both the proportion of agricultural production and industrial production invested as opposed to consumed rose considerably under Stalin. However, agriculture did not subsidize industrialization as commonly believed. The terms of trade actually moved significantly in favor of the agricultural sector. See Ellman, 1975. And that's referring to an article by Michael Ellman titled, "Did the Agricultural Surplus Provide the Resources for the Increase in Investment in the USSR During the First Five-Year Plan?" Back to the text. However, Bettelheim's point in the second volume of Class Struggles in the USSR is well taken. The method of collectivization imposed by the Communist Party Soviet Union, based in the cities, oppressed the peasantry. Although collectivization of agriculture is a socialist tenet, the collectivization of agriculture's first experiment brought starvation and disaffection that marks the weakness of agriculture even today in the Soviet Union. On the other hand, the rural bourgeoisie was defeated. No longer was the USSR dominated by petty commodity production. Even so, it should be noted that it was under Stalin that the parallel private plots and the tremendous role in non-grain agricultural production arose. At that time, private plots were a concession to the peasants, and to the fact that their lack of enthusiasm made the collective farming effort less than adequate for consumption needs. Today, less than 3% of land provides 65% of the potatoes, 35% of the meat and milk, 40% of vegetables, and 50% of eggs consumed. See Goldfield and Rothenberg, 1980. The price of the disaffection of the peasantry for the collectivization process is the existence of 40 million individual enterprises to this day. Whereas the prime labor force works on the state farms, the children and elderly are employed on the private plots. The cost of this is evident in the deaths and suicides in the rural areas today in the 15 to 19 age group. Faced with glaring distances between rhetoric and reality, the youth of the country suffer 2.5 times the death rate of city children for, quote, nervous system of feelings, end quote, problems, and 3 times for psychological breakdown. See Timofeyev, 1982. And that's referring to Leo Timofeyev, Black Market Technology in the USSR, or Peasant's Art of Starving, published in Telos, 1982. I'm going to look this person up. Leo Timofeyev. I'm not seeing anything for this person. Their paper does come up, though. Anyway. Where am I? This holdover of capitalism under Stalin is even harder to justify considering the years of peace and industrialization that the Soviet Union has experienced since Stalin. So far, we have seen that lasting capitalist features of the Soviet Union under Lenin and Stalin have been one-man management, a private farming sector, and collectivized (non-state) agriculture. There remains a discussion of the market for labor power that arose under Stalin and the changing social basis of the Communist Party, the Soviet Union. the money commodity, money prime process was not predominant under Stalin, bidding for labor power did occur. First, 29% of industrial workers were paid by piece rates in 1930, and 65% were paid by piece rates in 1931. The figures are even higher for key industries. What is worse is that Stalin's piece rates were progressive piece rates that increase the price per piece for the more pieces that are done. No doubt this kind of, quote, socialist competition, end quote, see Cliff 1974, divided workers from each other, but more importantly, it represented the expansion of the arena of bourgeois right, as there can be no better method of, quote, to each according to his work, end quote, than piece rates. Second, the struggle against egalitarianism in distribution was stressed one-sidedly throughout Stalin's industrialization program. Laws restricting party salaries to those of skilled workers, restricting incomes of two-post people to one and 1/2 times the maximum salary, restricting piece rate superworkers to 100% over the norm, and guaranteeing workers a minimum of 65% of the norm were abolished. See Cliff, 1974. Third, in an extension of the piece rate principle, managers in automotive transport enterprises in 1948 received bonuses according to their overfulfillment of the plan. This is a particularly ominous connection because it activates the distinction between labor and labor power. The firm bids over the labor power and then bids for the most efficient slave driver to coerce labor out of labor power. The distribution of income under Stalin certainly allowed material conditions sufficient for the generation of classes under socialism. There are two things to keep in mind about Stalin's policy of paying much more for piecework done above the planned goals. One is that Stalin did away with the rural markets and markets in the general sense of the new economic policy by setting prices and wages through the bureaucracy. By 1932, less than 1% of manufacturing workers were hired privately, whereas an eighth of such workers were in 1923. Footnote, see Nicholas. 1975, The Restoration of Capitalism in the Soviet Union, published by Liberator Books. Martin Nicholas, of course, being important because he translated the Grundrisse. No, what's his name? Martin Nicholas. Wait, am I spelling it right? Nikolaus. It's actually how to say that. Martin Nikolaus. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything for him that's like particular, like for him. Let's see. Restoration of Capitalism. Yeah, I'm not really seeing any big descriptions for this book. It looks like he wrote a paper under this title. Maybe it's a paper. I don't know. Maybe it's a review that I'm looking at. I'm not sure. It says on Philosophy Papers Archive. It's available on archives.org. Anyway, or not archive. Yeah, archive.org, the Internet Archive. Where the hell am I? By 1932, less than 1% of manufacturing workers were hired privately, whereas an eighth of such workers were in 1923. In a sense, all Stalin did was to replace the free market incentives with the planned bidding system. Stalin did not just add on material incentives in production. Stalin took away some and put in others. Second, Stalin used capitalist methods to fulfill a strict plan. In this sense, the real question is whether or not Stalin's political course represented that of the proletariat. Finally, the social base of the party changed from nearly two-thirds industrial workers in the early 1930s to mostly white-collar and other non-peasant and non-manual laborers by 1956. Stalin also supported the slogan, quote, "Cadres decide everything," end quote. Now, the stance of an intellectual worker does not have to be anti-revolutionary and capitalist. No such mechanical interpretation of the class origin of the CPSU members should be made. However, given the atmosphere of the time of absolute obedience to managers and specialists, it seems likely that the Communist Party Soviet Union's technocrat character indicated the crystallization of a class inside the CPSU. It's tricky here. It seems tricky here because the idea of like the absolute obedience to managers and specialists should be kind of like questioned, because one of the main victims in the Stalin era were specialists and technocrats. What else would be the purges? I think this concept of obedient to managers and specialists being kind of like a letting Stalin extremely off the hook. Once it established the law of value as its program, the bourgeoisie in the Communist Party Soviet Union could recruit workers and peasants amenable to that program. Now, isn't that weird? The idea of like the bourgeoisie in the CPSU. It's like almost like, obviously he probably thinks it's more like attached, this appellation of bourgeoisie to these CPSU members is somehow attached to the role in production, but it doesn't seem like that is being established at all. It's just like the bourgeoisie being like people who in some sense are sympathetic to markets or something like that, maybe. Once it has established the law of value as its program, the bourgeoisie and the CPSU could recruit workers and peasants amenable to that program. Here is seen the beauty of what Mao said about China's own possibility for capitalist restoration. Quote, "Our country at present practices a commodities system. The wage system is unequal too, as in the eighth grade wage scale and so forth. Under the dictatorship of the proletariat, such things can only be restricted. Therefore, if people like Lin Bao come to power, it will be quite easy for them to rig up the capitalist system," end quote. Mao. What emerges from all of Mao's works after 1962 is the fragility of socialism. Mao has called his own achievement only the first step in 10,000 li. So protracted is the struggle to get from capitalism to communism. The achievements of the socialist revolutionaries are modest. Not only must they contend with legacies from the past, but socialist revolutionaries face the generation of a new bourgeoisie in the Communist Party itself. This new bourgeoisie does not have its origins in the class background of its parents or the overthrown system. Rather, in the struggles concerning workplace and political control, remuneration and distribution, and the division of labor under socialism, a new bourgeoisie arises. I don't see any reason why that kind of the bureaucratic emphasis on workplace and political control, remuneration and distribution of the distribution of labor under socialism, in any way necessarily entails that this class is bourgeois. That doesn't mean that these things are true, but it's just like that label seems inappropriate to me, personally. What can be said about Khrushchev? What did Khrushchev add to the restoration of capitalism that was not already in place under Stalin? This is a good question, and in a sense, the historical demarcation is arbitrary. Wallerstein has argued that there is only one world system at a time. One can only hypothesize about efforts towards transition to socialism until there is a socialist world system. Also, if one takes a grand historical perspective of feudalism, as understood by Marxists, one realizes that feudalism did not fall in any one clean swoop or out of the blue. In this sense, a few hundred years from now, the debate on when or if the Soviet Union went capitalist may seem like a hair-splitting exercise if all the world has obtained a new system. Yet that does not mean that the analysis of the Soviet Union here and now is not important to that process. What Khrushchev did was primarily political. First, Khrushchev replaced Lenin with the, quote, three peacefuls. Second, Khrushchev established the good name of the, quote, Lever School of Economics and cleared the way for their debates. Third, Khrushchev tried to implement various labor-saving reforms and other economic changes. Finally, Khrushchev loosened up the air for the bourgeoisie in the party by attacking Stalin as he did. Those who wanted to implement capitalism could do so in the name of criticizing Stalin. Yeah, this is just like, basically was saying is like, oh yeah, if you were criticizing Stalin, you were probably trying to implement capitalism. It's basically is what it seems to me is like the attitude that's being expressed here, if not like the exact statement. Khrushchev loosened up the air for the bourgeoisie in the party by attacking Stalin as he did. Those who wanted to implement capitalism could do so in the name of criticizing Stalin. New section. Section C. The completion of the victory of capitalism in the relations of production. The logic of capitalism was made complete with the crystallization and victory of the capitalist class in the party and the introduction of the profit motive in production. Although the social composition of the Communist Party's Soviet Union may change, it has already established capitalist relations of production. One of the main signals in the superstructure of the victory of the bourgeoisie is the discussion of the law of value by economists and government. Quote, a highly important lever making for increased production is the creating, through a system of premiums, of a personal incentive to raising output, ... Scientific socialism, ... does not deny the significance in socialist economy of the law of value, market prices, and profit and loss accounting, ... As for profit and loss accounting in Soviet economy, not only does it not run counter to the socialist system of economy, but serves as a substantial stimulus to the development of socialist production, inasmuch as it contributes to a growth of profits. End quote. This is a quote from Nikolai Voznesensky, who was a political bureau member starting in 1947. Let's look this person up. Is it Nikolai Voz? Nikolai Voznesensky lived from 1903 to 1950 and was a Soviet politician and economic planner who oversaw the running of Gosplan, the USSR's state planning committee, during the German-Soviet War of 1941 to 1945. A protege of Andrei Zhdanov, Voznesensky was appointed deputy premier in May 1940. He became directly involved in the recovery of production associated with the evacuation of industry eastwards after the start of the war. In 1947, Nikolai, it should be Nikolai actually, I don't know. Where am I? The war economy of the years in the time of the Patriotic War records those years. His 1947 work, The Economy of the USSR During World War II, particularly the chapter The War Economy of the USSR in the Time of the Patriotic War, records those years. Following the war, Voznesensky was persecuted during the 1949 to 1950 Leningrad Affair. In a secret trial, he was found guilty of treason, sentenced to death, and executed immediately. The military collegium of the Supreme Court of the Soviet Union rehabilitated Nikolai Voznesensky in 1954. Voznesensky was a close associate of Alexei Kosygin and of Mikhail Rodionov. And the Leningrad Affair was a series of criminal cases fabricated in the late 1940s and early 1950s by Joseph Stalin in order to accuse a number of prominent Leningrad-based authority figures and members of the All-Union Communist Party Bolsheviks of treason and intention to create an anti-Soviet Russian nationalist organization based in the city. This happened in the aftermath of the siege of Leningrad during the war, the victorious end of which led to the mayor, his deputies, and others who kept Nazi German forces out of the city, earning fame and strong support as heroes all over the USSR. Back to the text. This is a quote from Nikolai Voznesensky, who was a political bureau member starting in 1947. In 1949, he implemented a price reform that brought prices more into line with the, quote, prices of production, end quote. The reform was rescinded by Stalin a year later, and the leaders of the reform were arrested and subsequently executed. In 1952, Stalin replied to discussions of the law of value, quote, it is sometimes asked whether the law of value exists and operates in our country under the socialist system. Yes, the law of value exists and operates in our country. Wherever commodities and commodity production exist, there the law of value must also exist, ... Does this mean that ... the law of value ... is the regulator of production in our country ... No, it does not. Actually, the sphere of operation of the law of value under our economic system is strictly limited and placed within definite bounds, end quote. Stalin then goes on to ask if the law of value regulates production, why light industry does not dominate Stalin then goes on to ask if the law of value regulates production, why light industry does not dominate, since light industry makes higher profits, why workers are not transferred from less profitable but necessary plants to more profitable but less necessary plants, and why I look at the short-run profit when the development of the country is at stake. Tony Cliff has pointed out that Marx and Engels believed that the law of value did not operate under socialism, but it seems that the important fact about Stalin is that Stalin was critical of the law of value, held that it had to be restricted and destroyed and not made out to be absolute permanence. And not made out to be of absolute permanence for all history. In late 1954, the verdict on the Leningrad Affair was reversed and its executors executed. In his famous speech of 1956, Khrushchev paid homage to the dead leaders of the economic reform. What is the evidence for the law of value's operation in the USSR today? Most importantly, wage labor exists, as is obvious to all, and labor power is bidded for. First, piece rates still exist for 56.6% of industrial workers as of 1969. Thus, wages are quite flexible to start with. Second, bonuses are now universally distributed for productivity gains at the discretion of the foreman and the directors. In labor-saving experiments, workers who remain after mass dismissals may expect higher bonuses. Third, although there is a general labor shortage in the USSR, the factory director and shop floor heads do have the right to hire and fire according to Soviet statutes. In the Chekino labor-saving experiment, there was an R equal to 0.69 correlation between growing productivity and dismissals. See Teckenberg, 1978. And that refers to a piece by Wolfgang Teckenberg titled Labor Turnover and Job Satisfaction, Indicators of Industrial Conflict in the USSR, published in Soviet Studies, 1978. Back to the text. Where am I? Fourth, wages, bonus plans, and housing offers are key parts in getting workers to uproot and change jobs. For example, quote, poor housing and low pay were the main reasons for leaving a job in a study conducted in 21 Novosibirsk enterprises, end quote. Depending on the enterprise, low wages and poor housing explained 24.7% each of the cases of workers leaving jobs. Fifth, the means of production themselves are commodities. It is the enterprise that has, quote, rights of possession, and purchases, sells, and leases its assets. 2/3 of trade turnover in 1971 was in the mean of production. The Soviet, quote, Statute on Socialist State Production Enterprise, end quote, reads, quote, the enterprise is headed by a director, ... The director of the enterprise may, without power of attorney, act in its name, ... dispose of the property and funds of the enterprise, end quote. Soviet Statute on Socialist State Production Enterprise. Finally, profit along with sales and product variety determine managerial bonuses. Thus, exchange value goals are given a positive enforcement mechanism by reforms adopted since 1965. This activates the labor and labor power distinction. Managers now have an incentive to get work out of their workers, not by political use value criteria, but by exchange value criteria. This alone is an important point in seeing the money commodity, money prime process at work. Directors lay out their best material incentives and hustle to get workers to work and directly reap rewards according to the profitability of their enterprises. Also, the workers themselves are prodded to actualize the labor power / labor distinction. Quote, socialist emulation should be oriented toward ... the raising of the profitability of production, end quote, according to Kosygin. Thus, the official orientation of the USSR is to evaluate production by exchange value criteria and thus to glorify the law of value and the bourgeois right to distribution. Profit in itself is officially, quote, the supreme criterion of efficiency in the enterprise, end quote. It was Khrushchev who first gave the green light of the 22nd Congress of the CPSU in 1961. Quote, we must elevate the importance of profit and profitability, end quote. Prime Minister Alexei Kosygin, who was the implementer of the measures completing capitalist restoration in the relations of production, and who escaped the, quote, Leningrad affair with a demotion through the intervention of others not associated with the affair, again presents the, quote, lever theory of the law of value. Quote, let us consider profit one of the economic instruments of socialism. A considerable enhancement of its role in socialist economy is an indispensable requisite for cost accounting, end quote. That's a quote from Bland's The Restoration of Capitalism in the Soviet Union, but I don't know who that quote is from. I don't think it's like, you know, there's like a lot of these quotes are coming from Bland, and they're kind of like secondary citations, but they're not really said like, oh, this is who's speaking on this occasion. The importance of profit is not just as an index to watch. Profit receives some easy avenues to play a role in regulating production from the CPSU. First, in 1961, before Khrushchev was dismissed in 1964, the CPSU program argued that, quote, prices must, to a growing extent, reflect the socially necessary outlay of labor, end quote. Bland, 1980. This again is another way of stating the law of value. Second, firms retaining 40% of their profits in 1969, and between 1966 and 1969, the average bonus fund tied to profits quadrupled. Finally, investment of enterprises is predominantly financed by profits, credit, depreciation allowances, and sales of the means of production. As of 1969 to 70, state grants covered only 18.8% of investment. Complete self-finance of enterprise was declared to be an eventual goal. In 1978, half of all investment came from profits at the enterprise level. Thus, expansion of the firm is tied to profit much the same way it is in the West. The allocation of investment by exchange value considerations is an important subject in itself. If the tying of bureaucrats' bonuses to profit is the carrot of the money commodity money prime process, then reorganization and interest rates are the stick that establish a minimum level of profit for the cooperation of enterprises. A directive from the Central Committee of the Communist Party Soviet Union in 1965 stated that, quote, it is necessary to introduce deductions in favor of the state budget from the profits of enterprises in proportion to the value of the fixed and circulating assets, fixed and circulating assets allocated to them, with these deductions being considered as payment for production assets, end quote. Bland, 1980. In 1971, those payments averaged 17%. At the same time, the importance of credit increased under the Lieberman reforms of 1965. By 1976, state credit financed 60% of circulating capital. Long-term credit has also played an increasing role in financing fixed assets. Moreover, the interest rate rose in 1967 to 4.25% for short-term loans and 4.5 to 6% for long-term loans. Profits are calculated after interest payments. A recent letter to Pravda stated what happens when enterprises lose their credit. Quote, we operate on the basis of mutual contracts. If someone's credit has been temporarily suspended, it turns out that we shouldn't ship him any output at all. But how, then, can a client overcome his difficulties? And what are we supposed to do with the output? End quote. Lotta and Zmansky, 1983, page 53. Thus, credit as social capital regulates allocation through interest rates. As usual, the Soviets themselves are best quoted for a description of their own economy. Quote, credit is made available on more favorable terms to enterprises that are working well, whereas economic and organization sanctions, in the form of restrictions on the right to credit and higher charges for the use of bank loans, are applied to enterprises and associations that fail to fulfill their basic plan indices to meet their obligations to the bank, end quote. Workers' Tribune, November-December 1982. With a profit as the major index, the bank, that gained independence in 1954 from the finance ministry and retained its monopoly character in the face of subsequent economy-wide decentralizations, seized to the concentration of capital. With the completion of this section, we have seen that even by Zemansky's and Goldfield's and Rothenberg's criteria, capitalism has been restored in the Soviet Union. Wage labor exists, and the money commodity money prime process does indeed go on. Also, it has been seen how the party itself changed its stance on the key issues of capitalism versus socialism, and how the social base of the CPSU allowed for the crystallization of a bourgeoisie right in that party. In the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, it is the job of the enterprise director and management to get labor out of labor power and collect part of the surplus value. The rest goes to the state ministries through interest, taxes on profit, and as a portion of depreciation. If the computing state capitals of the ministries were only to rent out their capital for interest, this alone would ensure that the money commodity money prime process, given the current context. But for now, there are two factions to the bourgeoisie depending on the method of realizing surplus value. The state banks and ministries represent a higher level of social capital in that they skim off the top from the enterprises which realize their own surplus value in bonuses and expansion. Parenthesis. Some surplus value is not realized and hence left as waste. End parenthesis. The relationship is analogous to that between finance capital and industrial capital. The state banks and ministries do not have 5-year plans with anything but the vaguest goals. Goldfield and Rothenberg argue that yearly plans are set, but the Soviets themselves say that with the new, quote, lever philosophy, there is, quote, indeterminacy in planning. According to the Soviet economists themselves, the enterprises, quote, draw up their production plans themselves on the basis of orders for goods placed by trading establishments and direct contracts concluded with them, end quote. Bland. In addition, according to Kosygin at the 25th Congress of the Communist Party Soviet Union, quote, we plan to complete the switch of associations and enterprises engaged in mass and large volume production to direct and long-term ties, basing their relations on long-term economic contracts, end quote. Parenthesis, Bland, 1980, page 45, end parenthesis. How can this be any more socialist than Lockheed's contracts with the Pentagon, contracts which also have some specifications? When GM and U.S. Steel contract with each other, they also specify terms with each other. There is nothing new about this kind of capitalist planning. The qualitative relationship between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat changed under Khrushchev. Khrushchev denied that the international proletariat would make its own history through armed struggle against imperialism. Moreover, Khrushchev established the law of values legitimacy in the Soviet Union and made attempts to establish profit and labor-saving processes. These attempts bore fruit even as Khrushchev was dismissed. It is not surprising that within 9 years of Khrushchev's speech on Stalin, factory directors gained the discretion to assign bonuses, hire and fire workers, and make decisions concerning the sale and use of the means of production. This qualitative relationship had its roots in the loss of workplace and political control by workers faced with one-man management and technocratic rule. The Communist Party Soviet Union became dominated by technocrats for technocrats, who saw to the enshrinement of bourgeois right to distribution and thus an improved material position via salaries. The bourgeoisie crystallized in the Communist Party Soviet Union and put the finishing touches on capitalism. Having established the foregoing, what is the logic of capital but the money commodity money prime process? Lenin's thesis on the export of capital is based on this same logic. The internal basis for imperialism exists. Now it is only a matter of examining bank loans, arms exports, and other investments abroad in that light. This has been done elsewhere. New section, Section D, the question of social consumption. A Marxist fundamentalist answer to Zemansky's question about the increasing proportion of wages going to social consumption would have to be that of indifference. What counts in Marxism is who is in control of the state and production. If the workers have no control in the workplace or in the political arena, then it does not matter if those workers are fed well. Work in politics will be boring and against the interests of the workers. This in itself will also say something about the problems of the worker outside the workplace. Estimates of vodka, beer, and wine consumption are doubling. Show a doubling between 1950 and 1960. By 1966, that figure showed another 50% growth. Parenthesis, RU 1974, page 94. That's by Revolutionary Union. How capitalism has been restored in the Soviet Union and what this means for the world struggle. Let's see if there's anything for that. Revolutionary Union and how capitalism has been restored in the Soviet Union. I don't think I see any description of this. Yeah, it's just a pamphlet. Okay. Back to the text. According to the Soviet Academy of Sciences, annual per capita vodka consumption increased from 5 liters in 1952 to 30 in 1983. See Bedeline, 1985. And that's a piece titled Soviet Capitalism in Monthly Review. I don't know if it's the same piece that I have on this channel called The Specificity of Soviet Capitalism. It's from the same year. I don't know. Anyway. A Soviet survey carried out in Leningrad shows that young workers are increasingly dissatisfied with the content of their work. 40% reported dissatisfaction in the mid-1960s. In 1976 to 77, 65% were unhappy. See parentheses, see Kravchenko, 1984, pages 274 to 275, end parentheses. And that's referring to a piece by a Bogdan Kravchenko, an article titled Workers and Bosses in the USSR, Aspects of the Relationship, published in Research in Political Economy, Volume 7. Wikipedia says Bogdan Kravchenko was born in 1946 and is the former director of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Alberta, Canada, and former vice rector of the National Academy for Public Administration under the President of Ukraine in Kiev, Ukraine. Kravchenko was born December... blah, blah, blah. Kravchenko was born December 29, 1946 in Günzburg, Germany. He received his higher education in Bishop's University, Quebec, the University of Toronto, and the University of Glasgow, Scotland. Bogdan Kravchenko completed his higher education with the title of Doctor of Social Sciences at Oxford University. Bogdan Kravchenko was an activist of the Ukrainian student and multicultural movements in Canada in the 1960s and 1970s, and the head of the Union of Ukrainian Students of Canada in 1969 to 70. According to John Paul Himka, who wrote a bunch of articles and critique, Bogdan Kravchenko was the, quote, leader of the Ukrainian left in Canada, end quote, during this period. However, together with Marko Bokun, Roman Senkis, Halina Freeland, Kristina Komyak, Miroslav Skandry, and others, he participated in the publication of the magazine Dialogue, the slogan of which was, quote, for socialism and democracy in independent Ukraine, end quote. From 1976 onwards, he was a researcher at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies of the University of Alberta, Canada, specialty Modern Ukraine and the Ukrainian SSR, and from 1986, the director of the Institute. His books are Social Change and National Consciousness in 20th Century Ukraine, published in 1985. He edited Ukraine After Shelest, 1983. Famine in Ukraine, 1932 to 1933, published in 1986. And Ukrainian Past, Ukrainian Present, published in 1993. I just wanted to look him up. I also wanted to look up Revolutionary Union. It says, RU organized on a revolutionary anti-revisionist Marxist-Leninist and Maoist party line with emphasis on black liberation struggle and liberation of all colonized peoples in and outside the United States. Okay, so where am I? The quality of work in political life is only one question left unanswered, even where there is progress in capitalist terms. Another is the cause of the increase in consumption. The industrialization of society has occurred under both capitalist and socialist regimes, so the consumption that they bring will increase in both cases. The USSR has had the fastest and most spectacular industrialization of any country. Soviet growth slowed appreciably in recent years, but more importantly, it seems that the current leaders of the Soviet Union benefit from riding on an industrial takeoff that started under Lenin and Stalin. Increasing social consumption takes place within the context of a larger surplus and the centralized infrastructure development that takes place in all large capitalist industrial nations. For example, public transport is present in industrial nations everywhere. The Soviet trend in social consumption is towards self-financed public services, which are apparently profitably operated so far. In an economy where the law of value is used as a lever, it is not surprising that social expenditures are viewed with the purpose of making a profit. Health and education in particular are particularly targeted to make a profit. Paid-for services were expected to increase 47%, while unpaid services were to increase 32% during the 1971 to 1975 plan. Quote, the preferential development of branches of paid services in the present stage conforms to the interests of the population. The population receives the possibility of supplying its needs more completely, end quote. According to one Soviet economist who was published in Problems of Economics, an important journal, parentheses, see Bland, 1980, in parentheses. Social consumption itself is still growing, but at a declining pace. From 1966 to 1970, the growth was 53%. From 1971 to 1975, it was 40%. Plans for 1976 to 1980 were for growth of 28 to 30%. At the same time, economists note a trend towards the expansion of enterprise profits, development, and bonus funds at a much greater rate than that of social consumption. Thus, the shift to emphasis on the enterprise for self-finance has not meant a corresponding increase in the enterprise's social responsibility. The housing shortage in the Soviet Union is well known and harder to explain in the post-World War II era. Yet, the housing budget has declined consistently as a proportion of investment. Housing was 23.2% of investment from 1956 to 1960, 18.3% from 1961 to 1965, and 17% from 1966 to 1970. Parenthesis, Bland, 1980, page 180. End parenthesis. Housing in the Soviet Union is highly subsidized. Tikhtin and Zhimansky cite housing as proof that the law of value does not operate in the Soviet Union. Even Bland says that housing is a true social service in the Soviet Union. Parentheses, see Bland, 1980, page 179, in parentheses. In reality, though, even housing is regulated by the law of value because management uses housing subsidies to attract skilled labor from outside the firm. Enterprises can lend 40 to 50% of the down payment for a private house. That loan is made a grant after the worker has worked a certain length of time with the firm. This kind of company loyalty scheme has its parallels in the West. As a result, the highest educational group is more than 3 times as likely as the lowest to receive 3 or more rooms in an apartment in Leningrad. Parentheses, see Teckenberg, 1981 to 82, page 63. And that article is called The Social Structure of the Soviet Working Class Towards a Statist Society, published in International Journal of Sociology. Looks like we're looking at a Wolfgang Teckenberg, but I don't think I'm seeing any description for him. Oh. You're not seeing, actually, never mind, I'm not seeing any descriptions of him. Anyway, back to the text. As a result, the highest educational group is more than 3 times as likely as the lowest to receive 3 or more rooms in an apartment in Leningrad. See Teckenberg, 1981-82. According to Teckenberg, quote, in occupational groups with higher income, dissatisfaction with the living standard was expressed rather by an attempt to get better apartments and homes than a rise in pay, end quote. Teckenberg, 1978. Other problems with social consumption trends that the author did not have time to investigate are drug taking, pollution, and the situation of the national minorities who are apparently being integrated into one nation even before communism is official. Parenthesis, Gorbachev's gaffes in which he speaks of Russia instead of the USSR may be conscious or unconscious indicators of this, end parenthesis. One quote from Peking Review indicates concern that while the USSR boasts of its progress in catching up with the West, economic growth has not resolved the problems of national minorities in the USSR. Quote, the average monthly wage of the worker and staff is non-Russian republics, in most non-Russian republics, is lower than that in the Russian Federated Republic. For instance, it is lower by 16% in Belarus, 20% in Georgia, and 21% in Moldavia. The 1973, quote, Yearbook of Soviet National Economic Statistics revealed that the 1973 per capita retail sales of consumer goods in Uzbek, Azerbaijan, and Tajik republics were less than 60% of those in the Russian Federated Republic. The number of doctors for every 10,000 people in the Central Asian republics was 1/3 less than in the Russian Federated Republic. End quote. Martin Nicholas. Teckenberg also reports that labor turnover ranges from, quote, 39.8% in Tajikistan, parenthesis 1967, and parenthesis, to 15.7% in the center of the RSFSR, end quote. Teckenberg, 1978. Thus, there continue to be significant divisions in the USSR by nationality. The situation of women in poverty should also be mentioned briefly. In 1967, the poverty line was established as 50 rubles per month per capita. 33 to 38% of the people in industrial areas would have qualified in 1967. Thus, women must work and they receive 65% of the income that men do. There is a 0.78 correlation between the percentage of women in 9 occupational groups and income. Parenthesis, Teckenberg, 1981 to 82. Pages 55, 57, 59, and parenthesis. The equality between men and women should also be noted, the inequality between men and women should also be noted as a source of classes and capitalism. Finally, health services in the USSR, along with the diet, smoking, and drinking habits of the people, have come to resemble those of Western countries. The treatment of these problems is also similar. Cancer and heart attacks rose during the 60s and 70s. Parenthesis, PL, 1981, pages 76 to 77. What is PL? Progressive Labor Party. 1981, PL magazine, Soviet Capitalism. The article is titled Soviet Capitalism. It is also a cause of great concern that the infant mortality rate rose in the Soviet Union and ceased to be reported. The Soviet officials in Zhermansky have tried to explain the problem as resulting from better infant mortality reporting procedures. Still, it is impossible to explain the increase of deaths in the middle age groups. Parenthesis, Bedeline, 1985, page 54, in parenthesis. Soviet healthcare, even relative to Cuban healthcare, looks poor because of its lack of preventive emphasis. New section. The bourgeoisie. There are at least 2 factions of the bourgeoisie. One is the factory directors and specialists, of whom 99% are in the Communist Party Soviet Union. Of course, there may be very powerful people, especially as leaders of production associations that combine more than one enterprise. The other faction of the bourgeoisie is the higher ranks of the state and party. Within the Soviet working and middle classes, inequalities are comparable to those in Great Britain. Many decile comparisons of incomes in the Soviet Union start from Soviet figures that compare the income of the bottom 10% with that of the top of the bottom 90%. Comparison, parenthesis, Wolf and Davis, 1984, in parenthesis. I'm not seeing anything for Lenny Wolf. It looks like they're affiliated with what? It says Lenny Wolf and Aaron Davison. Notes towards an analysis of the Soviet bourgeoisie, published in the publication Revolution, Summer, Revolutionary Communist Party Publications. Aaron Davis is the other name. Yeah, not seeing anything. I'm going to read the Wikipedia actually real quick for Revolutionary Communist Party USA. The Revolutionary Communist Party USA, also known as the RCP, the Revcoms or Revcom, is a new communist party in the United States, founded in 1975 and led by its chairman, Bob Avakian. The party organizes for a revolution to overthrow the system of capitalism and replace it with a socialist state with the final aim of world communism. The Revolutionary Communist Party is frequently described as a cult around Avakian. Actually, it's funny. I actually saw like a YouTube ad. I don't know if this is for Revolutionary Communist Party, but it was for Bob Avakian. New section: Bay Area Revolutionary Union. In early 1968, Bob Avakian, Leibel Bergman, H. Bruce Franklin, Stephen Charles Hamilton, and a score or so of others, comprising both veterans of the Communist Party USA and Bay Area radicals based in Palo Alto, Berkeley, and San Francisco, formed the Bay Area Revolutionary Union. Among the Bay Area Revolutionary Union's first task was to challenge the Maoist Progressive Labor Party, (PLP), over its positions on the Black Panther Party, the Chinese Cultural Revolution, and the direction of Maoism. The early Revolutionary Union joined with the Revolutionary Youth Movement faction in the Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, in opposing the Progressive Labor Party's role in SDS at its national convention in Chicago in 1969. The resulting split led to the Progressive Labor Party controlling the SDS name, while Revolutionary Youth Movement split into two factions. The Revolutionary Union organized on a revolutionary, anti-revisionist, Marxist-Leninist, and Maoist party line, with emphasis on the Black liberation struggle and the liberation of all colonized peoples in and outside of the United States. This political philosophy was elaborated in the 1969 pamphlet The Red Papers, later known as Red Papers I after subsequent publications, In 1971, Franklin, I guess that's H. Bruce Franklin, led a more militant faction of the Bay Area Revolutionary Union out of the organization to join Venceremos. The Revolutionary Union continued to expand, uniting collectives across the country and becoming a national organization with the long-term goal to form a new communist party. The new nationwide structure induced Bay Area Revolutionary Union to change its name to simply the Revolutionary Union. Avakian was elected to the Central Committee of the Revolutionary Union shortly thereafter. The RCP claims that of the various groups coming out of SDS, RCP was the first to seriously attempt to develop itself at the theoretical level with the publication of Red Papers. 1. In 1974, Revolutionary Union started publication of its newspaper, Revolution (renamed Revolutionary Worker) and adopting a weekly format in 1979. And parenthesis. I don't know if I said parenthesis first, but that last renamed Revolutionary Worker and adopting a weekly format in 1979. In parenthesis. In 1973, the anti-war group Vietnam Veterans Against the War, VVAW, entered into reforms after the end of the Vietnam War, including an explicitly anti-imperialist stance and opening its membership to civilians. During this period, the Revolutionary Union became a popular faction within the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, and the Revolutionary Union members gained influential positions in Vietnam Veterans Against the War, including in the National Council. This reached its peak in 1975 when the Revolutionary Union-controlled National Office voted to remove members, expel chapters, and place the organization into ideological uniformity. They later voted to dissolve themselves into the Revolutionary Union. A reconstituted group of non-Marxist members of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War filed and won a lawsuit prohibiting the Revolutionary Union-dominated group from using the Vietnam Veterans Against the War name, logos, and materials. Deep animosity persisted between the organizations. The Revolutionary Union organization was renamed Vietnam Veterans Against the War Anti-Imperialist, VVAWAI. Formation. In September 1975, after the integration of the Revolutionary Union's faction of the VVAW, Revolutionary Union constituted itself as the Revolutionary Communist Party, reconstituted itself as the Revolutionary Communist Party, RCP. After the death of Mao in 1976, the Revolutionary Communist Party split, with about 40% of its membership leaving, over which position to take in relation to the new Chinese leadership. Avakian led the majority of the party that rejected what it analyzed as a counter-revolutionary coup against Mao's allies. After this split, Avakian wrote and published the book Mao Zedong's Immortal Contributions, which summarizes the developments of Maoism. In January 1979, Avakian and 78 other party members and supporters were arrested and charged with various crimes in connection to a militant protest against Deng Xiaoping's visit to the White House. 17 demonstrators, including Avakian, were charged with multiple felonies that carried a combined sentence of up to 241 years. After the RCP and its supporters waged a mass campaign for political, legal, and other support for the defendants, the charges were dropped in 1982, by which time party leadership had decided to go into exile, with Avakian applying for political asylum in France, where he remained for many years. 1980s to 2000s. New section. The Revolutionary Communist Party organized the May Day 1980 rallies in 16 cities. Organized May Day 1980 rallies in 16 cities across the U.S., including Los Angeles, New York, Portland, Seattle, and Washington, D.C. Weeks before the May Day demonstrations, Revolutionary Communist Party member Damian Garcia and 2 others climbed the Alamo, tearing down the American flag from its pole and raising the red flag in its place before being arrested. Shortly thereafter, on the 22nd of April, Garcia was stabbed to death while organizing in a Los Angeles housing project. At the time, police said that Garcia's murder was gang-affiliated, while RCP insisted that he had been assassinated by the state in retaliation for his action at the Alamo. Avakian remarked in his memoir that Garcia's murder was, quote, very clearly tied in with police agents, ... It was an attack on our party, end quote. Avakian. In 1984, Bob Avakian and other members of the Revolutionary Communist Party co-founded the Revolutionary Internationalist Movement, RIM, a now defunct international grouping of Maoist parties, which were united by a founding declaration upholding Marxism, Leninism, Maoism. Other participating parties in RIM, Revolutionary Internationalist Movement, included the Communist Party of Peru, Shining Path, the Union of Iranian Communists, Sarbadoran, and the Revolutionary Communist Group of Colombia. Revolutionary Internationalist Movement published and distributed the magazines and news service A World to Win from 1981 to 2006. Revolutionary Internationalist Movement, since Revolutionary Internationalist Movement's dissolution in the 2000s, the publication is updated only on its website. In 2017, A World to Win was restructured as, quote, a more thoroughgoing tool for revolution based on Bob Avakian's new synthesis of communism, end quote. Flag burning by Revolutionary Communist Party members led to the Texas v. Johnson case, which established the burning of the American flag as a constitutionally protected right, bracket, citation needed, end bracket. In 2011, Revolutionary Communist spokesperson Carl Dix and Cornel West co-initiated the campaigns to, quote, to stop, quote, stop and frisk, end quote, and stop mass incarceration. Carl Dix and West appeared on Democracy Now! To discuss the state of Black America in the age of Obama. Revolutionary Communist Party organized Rise Up October Against Racism and Police Brutality. Attendees included Quentin Tarantino. In July 2016, mass protests and police arrests erupted over a flag burning by the Revolutionary Communist Party outside the Republican National Convention before a crowd of thousands. The next week, the Revolutionary Communist Party staged another flag burning outside the Democratic National Convention after denouncing the United States. Later that year, in response to Donald Trump's tweet calling for the criminalization of flag burning, Revolutionary Communist Party supporters burned another American flag outside the Trump International Hotel in New York City. In October 2016, Revolutionary Communist Party supporters were banned from the University of Chicago for trespassing after encouraging students to get organized with the revolutionaries, with one activist arrested by police. The next day, they returned to defy the ban while denouncing U.S. elections in America. Bracket, better source needed, in bracket. In August 2016, the Revolutionary Communist Party led protesters in a 2-day march on a barricaded police station after the fatal shooting of a black man by Milwaukee police. The police chief said the Revolutionary Communist Party had incited violence toward police. Revolutionary Communist Party members handed out flyers outside San Diego Levi's Stadium in support of Colin Kaepernick and NFL protest of the U.S. national anthem. In December 2016, in response to the election of Donald Trump, the Revolutionary Communist Party helped initiate and lead the ad hoc coalition Refuse Fascism, which had as its goal the prevention of Trump's inauguration through mass political protests and civil disobedience. After the inauguration, the organization adjusted to a mission of launching sustained mass protests aimed at forcing the removal of the Trump administration before the scheduled election of 2020. In July 2018, Refuse Fascism and Revolutionary Communist Party organized 100 handmaids to protest U.S. Vice President Mike Pence in New York City, saying, quote, he is a Christian fascist theocrat for whom The Handmaid's Tale is a model, end quote. Bracket, original research, question mark, end bracket. In October 2018, the Revolutionary Communist Party organized a demonstration in Chicago's Dali Plaza on the 23rd annual, quote, National Day of Protest to stop police brutality, end quote, in response to the police murder of Laquan McDonald and other black youth. Sorry, this Wikipedia is longer than I thought it would be. During the Q&A at a February 2019 event at USC, Revolutionary Communist Party supporters sparked controversy after criticizing Speaker Amanda Nguyen's work in the U.S. government during the War on Terror. Or Amanda Nguyen, I think is actually how I pronounce it. In March 2019, police detained a Revolution newspaper correspondent on the anniversary of the police shooting of Stephon Clark after the correspondent got into an argument with Al Sharpton while urging attendees to organize a revolution rather than political reforms. On International Women's Day 2019, the Revolution Club joined supporters of the Communist Party of Iran, Marxist-Leninist Maoists, to march through Westwood, California, calling for universal women's rights. Bracket, better source needed, end bracket. On Independence Day 2019, the Revolutionary Communist Party staged flag burnings at the U.S.-Mexico border and the White House, the latter being a demonstration against the, quote, Salute to America military parade, which resulted in 2 Revolutionary Communist Party supporters being attacked by the Proud Boys and arrested by Secret Service officers. The Revolutionary Communist Party originated as a Maoist political organization with roots in the New Left of the 1970s. In the 1990s, the Revolutionary Communist Party's political ideology was Marxism, Leninism, Maoism. Today, the framework for the Revolutionary Communist Party's political ideology is Avakian's, quote, new synthesis, or, quote, new communism, which it sees as an advancement of revolutionary theory. This has been debated among Maoists internationally, most of whom do not take it seriously. The Revolutionary Communist Party is atheist and claims to stress the scientific method. Revolutionary Communist Party leadership says, quote, the system cannot be reformed, it must be overthrown, end quote, and does not participate in charity or elections, instead organizing for total revolution to replace the capitalist system with a socialist system aiming for communism worldwide. Its goal is not to, quote, make America socialist, end quote, but instead, quote, a world without America and everything it stands for, end quote. Since the 2000s, Avakian's, quote, new communism is the Revolutionary Communist Party's ideological framework, which considers a scientific advancement of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism. Before that, the party was a founding member of the Revolutionary Internationalist movement. New section, Cult of Personality. The Revolutionary Communist Party began developing a cult of personality around Bob Avakian as part of the 1979 pivot catalyzed by the Deng Xiaoping protest trial. The goal was to both increase support for Avakian in the legal arena while also making the Revolutionary Communist Party a more revolutionary organization inspired by Joseph Stalin's cult of personality, Mao Zedong's cult of personality, and the more recent Free Huey campaign in which Avakian had participated. Relying on the theory of Georgy Plekhanov, and framing the development of a cult as a scientific organizational strategy, Avakian was put forward as a larger-than-life figure to revitalize the group. Members of both the left and the broader public often see the Revolutionary Communist Party as a small cult around Avakian. This perception was noted in The Independent in 2014, Harper's in 2016, Mike in 2017, Vice magazine in 2022. Members and groups on the left in organized labor and in protest movements have called Revolutionary Communist Party a cult. In 2016, former U.S. LAW National Coordinator Michael Eisenacher called Revolutionary Communist Party primarily, quote, a cult around Avakian, end quote. In June 2022, a coalition of 23 abortion rights, feminist, and mutual aid groups released a statement denouncing Revolutionary Communist Party and the affiliated organization Rise Up for Abortion Rights, including a description of the Revolutionary Communist Party as a cult. Revolutionary Communist Party members celebrate the organization as a cult of personality around Avakian. Revolutionary Communist Party publications say that the Revolutionary Communist Party and Avakian have encouraged controversy and serious debate over their views and a wide range of issues, engaging in numerous debates and polemics, while also taking a strong stance against destructive allegations in place of principled dialogue and building unity for what they term, quote, the emancipation of humanity, end quote. New section, LGBT issues. In the 1970s and 1980s, the Revolutionary Communist Party called homosexuality, quote, petty bourgeois, and prohibited LGBT people from joining the party. This outlook coexisted with a public line against gay bashing and attacks on homosexuals by religious bigots and fundamentalists, and was consistent with numerous groups of the new communist movement and the broader Marxist-Leninist movement of the period. The party's policy against homosexuality ended in 2001. The Revolutionary Communist Party platform now demands full recognition of LGBT rights as a fundamental element of establishing socialism. The Revolutionary Communist Party releases daily updates online and a periodic print edition of its weekly newspaper, Revolution, formerly called Revolutionary Worker, 1979 to 2005, in English and Spanish. In December 2016, party members and others co-initiated Refuse Fascism, a coalition group aiming to, quote, drive out the Trump administration through sustained street protests. InfoWars and other far-right conspiracy theory websites claimed the Revolutionary Communist Party and Refuse Fascism were organizing a military overthrow of the government on the 4th of November 2017. Several nationwide anti-Trump protest marches were organized for that day, numbering in the thousands. Refuse Fascism protesters were arrested in September 2017 after blocking 4 lanes of the 101 freeway in Los Angeles during rush hour to, quote, sound the alarm about fascism, end quote. The Revolutionary Communist Party supporters Michael Slate and Sunsara Taylor have regularly aired shows and radio networks KPFK and WBAI, respectively, where they discuss news and politics with guests. Revolution books. Revolutionary Communist Party branches opened Revolution Books stores in major U.S. cities and became a frequent presence in protest movements. Prison outreach. The RCP runs the Prison Revolutionary Literature Fund, which sends its newspapers and other political works from its publishing press to prisoners. The fund states that its aim is to provide, quote, an educational opportunity for prisoners to engage with world events and key political, cultural, and philosophical questions from a unique communistic perspective, including discussions of morality, religion, science, and the arts centered around a positive socialist light, end quote. Sorry for that detour, but I was like, what the hell are these, what's this guy's organization about, you know? Or like, what is this guy's milieu? Maybe that particular is not his milieu, but he's citing the publications of this organization as a source, so, you know. Anyway. Where am I? Okay. Within the Soviet working and middle classes, inequalities are comparable to those in Great Britain. Many decile comparisons of incomes in the Soviet Union start from Soviet figures that compare the income of the bottom 10% with that of the top 90%, Wolf and Davis, 1984, page 13, Comparison with Western deciles of a like construction show that the Soviet Union is comparable or slightly worse than Great Britain, according to Peter Wiles, who excludes income derived from property in the calculations. Wolf and Davis, 1984, Some contend that under Stalin, wage differentials increased the most rapidly, thus demonstrating that he promoted bourgeois right the most. However, from 1929 to 1940, so many peasants were raised into the industrial proletariat that its size tripled. This means that the urban-rural gap closed some and may have offset the losses in intra-working class equality.
The top 0.5% of earners in the Soviet Union quite plausibly compare with the top 0.5% in the United States. In the United States, top earners earn 12 to 15 times the U.S. average wage. In the USSR, a factory director may make 500 rubles officially and another 400 rubles through benefits in stores. Indeed, since no information is available on the salaries of the top 2 million earners of the nomenklatura, the benefits of an elite post may make the official salary a mere formality. In any case, 900 rubles a month compared with the minimum wage of 70 rubles is not far-fetched. Saving accounts also collect interest which should be included in the higher incomes of the state bourgeoisie. According to Roy Medvedev, quote, there are in the US about 13,000 millionaires, i.e. top bosses whose bank accounts amount to 7-digit sums, end quote. Nicholas, 1975. Finally, the top income tax does not surpass 13%, leaving out considerations of children, in parenthesis. In 1960, the Communist Party Soviet Union announced its intention to abolish all income taxes. CPL, which is Progressive Labor Party. And what else they say? So the one. 1981, page 57, and Daub, 1966. And that's Maurice Daub, Soviet Economic Policy since 1917, published in 1966. As for the reproduction of the bourgeoisie, quote, formal higher education, not activism alone, has become the indispensable ingredient for any higher level position. Higher education, on the other hand, has emerged as the preserve of the offspring of white-collar staff and the intelligentsia, and this group has become self-recruiting, end quote. Parenthesis, Kravchenko, 1984, page 274, end parenthesis. 90% of party people and specialists are highly educated, but only 1/3 of high schoolers wanted to go to college in the 1970s, compared with 90% in the 1960s. The percentages of those who go to 9th grade varies with parental occupation. 25% of low-skilled workers' offspring, 52% of skilled workers, 70% of specialists with secondary specialist training, and 86% of specialists with higher education. Moreover, 19% of low-skilled workers' children with, quote, low grades, and 77% of, quote, upper strata children with, quote, low grades went to 9th grade. Upper strata, quote, low grades cases go on to 9th grade more often than workers' children with, quote, high grades, end quote. Not surprisingly, the children of specialists made up 50% of the student body of colleagues in the late 1960s, approximately 3 times their proportion of the population. Teckenberg notes the importance of occupational inheritance. Teckenberg's data for respondents in UFA 1969/70 show that 32.8% of the intelligentsia came from that same background. Meanwhile, 72.5% of the intelligentsia's children were also in the intelligentsia. Meanwhile, 44.6% of workers came from a worker family, and children of workers usually became workers, 59.1%, while 31.4% joined the intelligentsia, 8.6% joined the employee category, and 0.9% do not have an occupation yet. The tendency is for workers to raise workers and intellectuals to raise intellectuals. Parentheses, see Timofev, 1982, Wolf and Davis, 1984, Progressive Labor, 1981, and Teckenberg, 1981 to 82, in parentheses. Although capitalism is not marked by classes with birthrights, Bohdan Kravchenko summarized a number of surveys on the perpetuation of the mental/manual labor distinction in the USSR. Quote, the lower the age, the higher the weight of workers of workers' origin. ... In this survey of a factory in the Urals, 70% of all workers under 20 years of age were the grandchildren of workers. On the other hand, 100% of specialists were the offspring of specialists. ... A 1978 survey of the machine industry workers in Leningrad found that 90% were of working class origin, whereas 80% of skilled scientific personnel were born into the intelligentsia. ... Thus, the first large-scale hereditary proletariat in the history of the USSR has formed. End quote. Kravchenko, 1984. The Soviets do not provide income distribution figures on the state capitalist class. Independent calculations and analyses of official and unofficial incomes do not necessarily sustain the myths propagated in decile comparisons. In any case, it is not important how many cars, yachts, and country dakas the state capitalists buy. The state capitalist class is a group of people that occupy a structural position. They control the means of production, hiring and firing, bonuses, housing, and income distribution. To get into the state capitalist class, one must manage an enterprise profitably enough to borrow and rent enough state capital to bid high enough for labor power. One must expand or face takeover. The grand consumption of the old Rockefellers and Vanderbilts may not take place, but Soviet production is still for profit, not for use. New section. One of the themes of this paper is how the law of value can find its expression in a number of ways. Many would argue that since bureaucrats set prices, that the law of value cannot operate in the Soviet Union. However, we have seen how wages are quite flexible and tied to productivity, how even housing is distributed for productivity reasons, and how features such as the black market and the concept of contracting among state branches can lead to providing an opening for the law of value. Indeed, planning bureaucrats pad their estimates for the parochial interest of their own enterprises, which is not surprising given the increasingly self-financed nature of enterprises. The deputy chairman of the State Committee on Prices estimates that 20% or more of input costs claimed by enterprises are padding, Lada and Zhimansky, 1983, Prices are fixed by people with interest. Enterprises that want higher prices raise the estimates of their cost. This is a form of bidding with central authorities. A plan may start with a certain goal for a firm, but it is expressed in current price terms. When the price changes before the plan is fulfilled, it becomes impossible to tell if a firm fulfilled its plan or not. The very measuring rod in exchange value terms changes. Quote, as a result of the practice of making partial changes in price, a practice that has become established in the last few years, higher echelon economic organs could not correctly plan and exercise effective control over the fulfillment of the plans, end quote. According to one article in Problems in Economics cited in Nikolaus, 1975. Even if fixed prices were never adjusted in the Soviet Union, the law of value can circumvent fixed prices. Enterprises contract for quantity. If the price is too low, they will contract for less, and if the plan is, quote, indeterminate, end quote, then it will not be fulfilled. At one chemical and machinery plant, the introduction of profit criteria resulted in 46% fulfillment of the production plan for unprofitable reactors and overfulfillment for profitable rotary devices. One can also imagine that there will be pressure on the technique and quality of production to adjust it if the price is out of line, that is, unless exchange value goals are not the object in the first place. Reorganization of Soviet industry has been towards ever larger trusts, groupings of firms in the same industry, since the early 70s. By 1981, about 50% of industrial output went through production associations. In Problems in Economics in 1972, one economist claimed that, quote, the producer dictates the price, especially in establishing one-time and temporary prices on newly developed types of products, and frequently uses the existing shortage for a given group or type of resources to bring pressure to bear on the customer, end quote. Parentheses, cited in Nicolaus, 1975, end parentheses. Such industrial associations can, quote, influence the entire price formation process, end quote. Parentheses, Lieberman concludes that, quote, perhaps one of the most significant consequences of the economic reform is the growing influence of industrial enterprises on the superior agencies. The reform is destroying and will continue to destroy many established patterns, including the distrust shown by executive agencies for production organizers and economists at the enterprises, end quote. Lieberman. Workers' Tribune, parenthesis, Workers' Tribune, September-October 1982. And it's from a piece titled, actually there's two pieces listed here from 1982. It says, one is Monopoly Capitalist, quote, Production Associations and Economic Crisis in Russia. That's probably what we're looking for here. Which was released by the Bolshevik League. Yeah, I can't find like a brief description of this group. Anyway, back to the text. Where the hell am I? When the state capitalists at the enterprise and association level run the state itself in conjunction with the more social state capitalists at the bank and ministerial level, there can be little doubt as to the parochial nature of pricing. A more serious problem for the analysis here than the problem of bureaucratic pricing is the apparent non-existence of unemployment. Beijing Review issued articles equating job turnover with unemployment. However, job turnover can also be interpreted as voluntary choices by workers, and in any case they end up in new jobs. In its scholarly attempt at the subject, the Bolshevik League, recently splintered and perhaps defunct, finds the greatest amount of existing evidence of unemployment among youth, women, and the minority nationalities. Bolshevik League quotes Brezhnev at the 26th Congress, quote, in Central Asia and in some parts of the Caucasus, there is, on the contrary, a surplus of manpower, particularly in the countryside, end quote. Bolshevik Leninist, 1983. The Bolshevik League, 1983. Published with New International Distributors. Can't find it. Anything on it? Where am I? Other reports Bolshevik League cites find unemployment as high as 25% in minority regions, 100,000 unemployed youth in the Russian Republic, and an overall rate of unemployment higher than that found in Scandinavia. Still, Khrushchev and Khrushchev's followers attempted but failed in implementing some labor-saving programs. The Shchikino experiment, Have I looked this up already? Szczecino. Experiment. I don't know, I'm not seeing anything for it. Where am I? Where the heck am I? God damn it. Okay, the Szczecino experiment was backed by the CPSU Central Committee, but only gained implementation in 1973 in 700 enterprises. Overall, the workers seemed to be in a good political position in terms of having enough jobs. What seems to be happening is that we have established the relevance of Marx's theory of capitalism for the USSR, but we do not get some important results. Competition and labor-saving measures do not result in massive unemployment and recession, although no one could deny that there is often overproduction and shortages. Potential answers are suggested by the framework here, but go beyond the scope of this paper. Up to this point, there has been no consideration of the international situation. At least one organization has written a book titled On the Roots of Revisionism, which tries to root capitalist restoration in Stalin's line on the Popular Front and World War II. In the 1960s and 1970s, Beijing Review focused on Soviet diplomatic and military aggression. Economically, the Soviet bloc's Comecon organization is very important. Studies have been made of exploitation of the Eastern Economic Bloc by the USSR. See Graziani in Review of Radical Political Economics, special issue on the Soviet Union, end parenthesis. So that's in reference to Giovanni Graziani, 1981 article, Dependency Structures in Comecon, published in Review of Radical Political Economics. In 1982, trade amounted to 24% of Soviet national income. Thus, foreign economic relations are an important piece omitted from this paper. Such economic relations may explain the lack of a recession in the Soviet Union proper. As Szymanski points out, Germany and Switzerland have had long periods of no unemployment for their own nationals by exploiting the International Reserve Army, Turks, and others. The long-run view of the Soviet bloc may point to the CPSU's need to buy off a section of the Soviet workers. Teckenberg refers to a dual labor market and a labor aristocracy to explain differences in job turnover by region, industry, and size of the firm in the Soviet Union. See Teckenberg, 1978. This would be an additional reason for social consumption in the Soviet Union. The Soviets under Khrushchev embarked on economic competition with the Western world. Victory in that competition could come through better and more efficient exploitation procedures, which allow the increased social consumption of Soviet workers at the expense of workers in other countries. When the entirety of the Soviet bloc is considered, it is clear that Soviet-dominated economies have had crises or occasional negative growth. Cuba, Poland, Czechoslovakia, the Soviets' more peripheral allies in Angola and Ethiopia are in bad shape too. In any case, growth in the USSR's gross social product has decelerated. Also, quote, annual consumption increased by only 1.6% between 1976 and 1980 versus 4.7% between 1966 and 1970, end quote. Bedeline, 1985. It may be just a matter of time before business cycles with positive and negative growth phases start to appear. If so, the Soviets' years of growth since the state capitalist counter-revolution may not be any more unusual than some booms in industrializing capitalist countries. The Soviet capitalist class is not the first to face constraints in the class struggle. American and British firms paid the price for long periods of labor quiescence. Strong unions can determine shop floor issues and get themselves loyalty-oriented welfare schemes from a capitalist class that is rolling for big stakes in a world war of competition. Not everything about the Soviet Union means misery for the workers, because the capitalist class does not have infinite control over workers. However, even the victories of the Soviet working class must be put in international perspective. The Soviet welfare state is partly crumbs from the social imperialist plate. New section, section 5, conclusion. Capitalism was all but in place during the new economic policy, when the Bolsheviks retained the, quote, commanding heights of the economy and the ruthless will to move forward into socialism. No matter what one's ideological view is of the collectivization procedure, collective agriculture is a goal of socialism. The collectives eliminated the need for millions of rural traders and a rich peasant class. Although Stalin fought one-sidedly against egalitarianism, because Stalin saw material incentives as the only way to motivate workers for an all-out industrialization drive, Stalin abolished the new economic policy era profit motive in industry and the rural free market. Until the end of Stalin's life, Stalin retained a critical view of the law of value and distinguished between use value and exchange value. Capitalism was all but established when Khrushchev came to power. The party had taken on a white-collar look in an atmosphere of strict hierarchy and one-man management. Piece rate work and bonuses ruled the economy. Stalin's dictum had been that, quote, cadres decide everything, end quote, thus dampening the role of the masses in building socialism. If Lenin and Stalin were critical of their own economic context, Lenin's viewing the NEP as capitalism, or at best state capitalism, and Stalin seeing the law of value still unconquered, Khrushchev dropped the critical spirit of the founding Bolsheviks. Khrushchev sanctioned the, quote, Lever school of economics and attempted to adopt profit, interest, and labor-saving reforms. Khrushchev's failure was not so great that the Lieberman reforms could not be implemented shortly after Khrushchev's ouster. The Kosygin-Lieberman reforms snuff out even the pretense of attempting to move to socialism, where capitalist features of the economy had threatened to swamp the Russian Revolution ever since 1917. The reforms linked profits to bonuses of workers and managers, thus giving a carrot to the money commodity, money prime process. The imposition of interest rates on all capital and the extension of credit based on interest demanded a minimum level of profits for firms that were to continue to operate and expand. This was one stick in the money commodity, money prime process. Another stick is reorganization by the ministries. It is a mistake to view centralization as inherently socialist. Rather, concentration of firms and reorganization of management is another method for ensuring that only those who play by the rules run the show. The production association and planning bureaucrats should not be mistaken for socialists trying to corral their bourgeois enemies at the enterprise level. Factory directors and upper party and government officials are both part of the state capitalist class. Okay, so that is the end of, what was the original title? Secondary Literature on the Question of the Restoration of Capitalism in the Soviet Union by Henry Park. yeah, I don't have anything to say about this piece. Um, this guy's politics are pretty whack, but it's necessary to look at this line of discussion, which I honestly have to say I'm fairly unfamiliar with, except for references to Betelime and Tony Cliff, of course. But yeah, thanks for listening.